Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The chill of the night wrapped around me like a damp shroud as I stood in front of the old Weatherby estate, its crumbling facade looming against the moonlit sky. I'd heard the stories, the whispers of spirits trapped within its walls, the echoes of laughter that turned to screams. My friends dared me to explore the place, to prove my bravery, but deep down, I felt something more than just fear. It was an insatiable curiosity, a pull that urged me to uncover the truth hidden beneath the layers of dust and time. "Are you seriously going in there?" Jess's voice trembled beside me, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What if something happens to you?" "Nothing's going to happen," I replied, trying to mask my own anxiety with bravado. "It's just a house, a creepy old house." "Creepy. It's a death trap," Sam chimed in, his bravado slipping as he shoved his hands into his pockets. "I say we just go back to the bonfire." I turned to them, my heart pounding in sync with the thrumming energy of the night. "You guys can go back if you want. I need to see inside. There might be something interesting like a ghost trying to kill you." Jess shot back, but a nervous laugh escaped her lips. "I can't believe you're doing this." Ignoring Jess's protests, I stepped forward, the rusty gate creaking ominously as I pushed it open. A shiver raced up my spine, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what secrets this place held. The air inside the house was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. I pulled out my phone, its flashlight flickering to life, casting eerie shadows across the grand foyer. Torn wallpaper hung limply from the walls, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I took a deep breath, the thrill of the unknown igniting my senses. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Anyone here?" The only answer was the wind howling through the cracked windows, a mournful sound that sent chills racing through me. I felt ridiculous, standing alone in a haunted house, but the thrill of exploration outweighed my fear. As I wandered deeper into the house, I could hear my friends outside, their voices muffled but present. "She's going to get herself killed," Sam muttered, and Jess chimed in with a nervous laugh. "Maybe we should start a ghost hunting club." I rolled my eyes, pushing forward, determined to find something. Anything that would validate my decision to come here. I ran my fingers along the dusty banister, glancing at the faded portraits lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me, watching with a mix of sorrow and malice. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the upstairs, a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, the thrill of fear flooding my veins. "What was that?" I whispered to myself, gripping my phone tighter. I glanced back toward the door, tempted to retreat, but the pull of curiosity was stronger. I had to see what was up there. I climbed the staircase, each step protesting under my weight, and the shadows seemed to dance around me as I ascended. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before me, doors lining either side, their surfaces marred by years of neglect. I hesitated, my heart racing, as I approached the first door on my right. Pushing it open, I was met with a room swallowed by darkness, the air heavy with the scent of mold. "Hello," I called again, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" Silence answered me, but then I heard it. A soft, haunting hum. A melody so sweet, yet so sorrowful, that it sent shivers down my spine. It resonated from the far end of the hallway, Pulling me closer, I crept down the corridor, the hum growing louder, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. My heart raced as I reached the last door. Its wood splintered and worn. I pushed it open, and the sound reached a crescendo, filling the room with an ethereal light. Inside, a girl sat on the floor, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, fingers dancing over an old music box. She looked up, her eyes wide and filled with a haunting sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like a breeze rustling through leaves. "Who are you?" I stammered, my fear giving way to an odd sense of calm. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to wake them up," she said, her eyes glazing over. "This place, it's trapped in time." "Trapped?" I repeated, glancing around the room. "What do you mean? What do you mean?" She shrugged, her fingers never stopping their graceful dance over the music box. "The people here, they never left. They're still waiting for someone to remember them." A shiver ran through me. What happened to them? What happened to them? "They lost their way," she murmured, her gaze distant. "They thought they could escape, but the house won't let them go." My heart raced as I realized the weight of her words. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Her smile was bittersweet. But I can help you find a way out. If only you remember us." Before I could respond, the music box let out a high-pitched whine, and the girl's eyes widened in fear. "They're coming," she cried, her voice rising in panic. "You have to go." I turned to run, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the hallway twisted and shifted, the shadows closing in around me. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the very fabric of reality warping. "Wait!" I screamed, but the girl was gone, her presence fading like the last notes of the music box. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought against the darkness closing in. I dashed down the hallway, my heart racing, desperation driving me. "Jess! Sam!" I shouted, but my voice echoed back at me, mocking. Suddenly, a figure loomed before me, a dark silhouette blocking my path. I skidded to a halt, my heart pounding as dread washed over me. I demanded, my voice trembling. "Time to join us," it hissed, a voice that slithered into my mind like a serpent. I recognized it as the sound of those trapped within the house, their voices whispering in unison, beckoning me closer. "No!" I shouted, spinning around to find another figure emerging from the shadows. Panic surged through me as I realized the darkness was closing in, the walls pulsing with an oppressive energy. I had to escape. I ran back toward the stairs, the figures pursuing me, their whispers growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. "Join us, remember." My foot slipped on the last step, and I tumbled forward, crashing into the foyer below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around for an escape. I burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I stumbled down the steps, my heart racing as I turned back to look at the house. The shadows writhed in its windows, the whispers fading into a cacophony of screams. "Did you see her?" Jess gasped, rushing to my side. "What happened?" "Get out! We have to leave," I shouted, my breath coming in heaves. "Now!" Sam and Jess exchanged worried glances, but I grabbed their arms and pulled them away from the house, the darkness still clawing at my back. I could feel the weight of the spirits, their sorrow and anger pressing down on me. We ran toward the tree line, the sounds of the house fading behind us, but I knew it was not over. The faces of those trapped within haunted me. I could still hear their cries, their pleas for remembrance echoing in my mind. "Why are you so scared?" Sam panted as we reached the edge of the woods. "It's just an old house. Just an old house, I shot back, my heart racing. You didn't see them. They're trapped, waiting for someone to remember them. Jess's eyes widened. What do you mean? You're scaring me. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. They were lost. The girl, she thought I could help them. But they won't let me go. They want me to remember. Remember what? Sam asked, confusion etched on his face. Confusion etched on his face. Everything, I whispered, the weight of the truth settling heavily in my chest. If I don't escape, I'll become one of them. We stumbled through the underbrush, the moonlight casting ghostly shadows around us. The night was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant howls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, waiting for my return. As we reached the edge of the woods, I turned back one last time. A looming silhouette of the Weatherby estate surrounded by darkness. The whispers grew louder, a haunting chorus that echoed in my mind. But I refused to let them pull me back. Let's go, I said, determination flooding my voice. We need to leave this place behind. And as we ran, the shadows of the past began to fade. But the memory of the girl lingered like a ghost in the recesses of my mind. A reminder of the spirits trapped within the walls of the Weatherby estate, waiting for someone brave enough to remember. Not the rhythmic tap of a trapped moth, nor the insistent buzz of a determined fly. This was a soft brushing, like the whisper of fabric against a pane, but carrying peculiar weight, a subtle insistence that prickled at the edge of her awareness, even as rain lashed against the windows. She'd been trying to concentrate on the faded map spread across the antique oak table, its brittle edges threatening to crumble with each careful fold. The house, nestled deep within the overgrown embrace of Blackwood Forest, had been her grandmother's legacy, a place of whispered childhood stories and forgotten shadows. Now it was hers, and Amelia, driven by a need for solitude and a fascination with its history, had come to unravel its secrets. The flutter returned, more insistent this time, and Amelia finally looked up. The rain-streaked window offered little clarity, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, a pale, almost translucent hand pressed flat against the glass. It was impossibly long, the fingers spindly and unnaturally extended, the knuckles bulbous and strangely jointed. No human hand could contort itself in such a way, and certainly no human hand would be pressed against the second-story window of a house surrounded by a wall of ancient, unyielding trees. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced the warm fog of the fire she'd built. She recoiled from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Logic screamed at her. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection, something her tired mind had conjured. But the image lingered, imprinted on her retina with chilling clarity. Swallowing her fear, Amelia cautiously approached the window again. The hand was gone. Only the relentless rain and the swaying branches of the ancient oak outside greeted her. She strained her eyes, scanning the darkness, the heavy undergrowth beneath the tree. Nothing. Nothing. Just nerves, she muttered, her voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. The house was old, creaking and groaning with the wind, and the isolation was starting to play tricks on her. She turned back to the map, trying to focus on the intricate lines in faded ink, the names of long-gone landowners, the cryptic symbols marking forgotten trails. But the unease remained, a persistent itch beneath her skin. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. The house felt different now, no longer a silent observer, but something aware. Later that evening, as darkness deepened and the wind howled like a tormented beast, Amelia heard another sound, a soft scraping, this time from the back of the house. She froze, the half-finished cup of tea trembling in her hand. It sounded like something dragging, perhaps a heavy branch being pulled across the stone path. She crept to the back window, peering into the inky blackness. The rain had eased, leaving a slick sheen on the overgrown garden. Again, nothing, but the scraping sound persisted, moving slowly, deliberately, along the length of the house. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. This wasn't her imagination. Something was out there. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, its cold weight a small comfort in her trembling hand. Her breath caught in her throat as the scraping stopped directly beneath the window. A moment of absolute silence followed, broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then, a low, guttural sigh, like air escaping from ancient bellows. It was close. Uncomfortably, terrifyingly close. Amelia backed away from the window, her eyes darting around the room. The old house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every noise amplified by her fear. She had to get out. She moved quickly but silently, her bare feet padding softly on the worn wooden floor. The front door was her only option. The scraping sound was moving that way too. She could hear it now, not just dragging, but a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. As she reached the hallway, she saw it. A long, pale finger, impossibly thin and elongated, snaked under the front door, its nail scraping against the polished oak. It twitched almost inquisitively, as if sensing her presence. Amelia's scream caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Whatever was outside, it wasn't human. She turned and fled towards the back of the house, desperate to put distance between herself and the thing at the door. She found herself in the kitchen, the room bathed in the pale glow of the moon peeking through the clouds. Her eyes fell on the heavy meat cleaver hanging on the wall. It felt barbaric, but in that moment, it was her only hope. Clutching the cleaver, her knuckles white, Amelia listened. The scraping had stopped at the front door, replaced by a heavier thudding, as if something was trying to force its way in. She could hear the splintering of old wood. She knew she couldn't stay here. The back door was bolted, but the windows. She ran to the nearest window, fumbling with the latch. It was stuck, rusted in place. Panic clawed at her. Then she heard it, a soft whisper, just outside the window. It wasn't language, not exactly, but a sibilant, chilling sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around her. And then, the fluttering returned, this time against the glass right beside her head. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, a strangled sob escaping her lips. She could feel the presence outside, cold and malevolent. She braced herself, the cleaver raised, ready to fight whatever was trying to get in. But it didn't break the glass. Instead, the window began to melt. Like ice, but like wax, the glass softening and distorting, flowing downwards like thick liquid. Through the dissolving pane, she saw the face. It was pale. The skin stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. The eyes were large and black, devoid of pupils, reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural gleam. The mouth was a thin, lipless slit, and from it came that whispering sound, closer now, inside her head. Terror paralyzed her. The cleaver slipped from her numb fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. The melting window opened, revealing a figure that seemed to flow through the gap like smoke. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, terminating in those horrifying, elongated hands. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its unnatural form, gliding across the kitchen floor towards Amelia could only stare, her mind unable to process the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. The creature stopped before her, its black eyes fixed on hers. The whispering intensified, a cacophony of sibilant sounds that seemed to burrow into her skull, promising pain and oblivion. Then it reached out, One of those impossibly long fingers brushed against her cheek. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. A cold that seeped into her bones, stealing her warmth, her will, her very life force. Amelia's vision blurred. She felt herself falling, not physically, but inward, into a swirling vortex of darkness. The whispering became a roar, and the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the creature's thin, lipless mouth opening in a silent, chilling smile. The house in Blackwood Forest remained, shrouded in mist and silence. The rain had stopped, and the first rays of dawn painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Inside, the remnants of Amelia's life lay scattered. The open map, the overturned teacup, the discarded cleaver, and in the kitchen, the melted remains of the window shimmered like petrified tears, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded within its walls. The flutter against the glass had ceased, replaced by an unsettling stillness, a stillness that spoke of something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed another soul. It coated the back of my tongue as I unlocked the heavy oak door of the Blackwood Archive. Night security wasn't a glamorous job, but it was quiet, and quiet was what I needed. The vast, echoing space, usually filled with the hushed whispers of historians and the rustle of aged paper, became my solitary domain between dusk and dawn. The iron taste was new. The usual sensory menu in the archive consisted of the musty scent of centuries-old vellum, the faint, lingering aroma of beeswax from preserved documents, and the almost silent hum of the climate control system. Tonight, the metallic tang was persistent, like a phantom limb pain, a sensation without a source. I ran my tongue over my teeth, checking for any injury, but found nothing. I made my rounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the inky blackness between the towering shelves. The archive was a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge, a repository of secrets whispered across generations. Tonight, even the usual comforting rhythm of my footsteps echoing in the stillness felt off, louder. Somehow, or perhaps it was the unnerving silence that surrounded them, a silence that felt heavy, expectant. In the restricted section, tucked away behind 3 levels of security, the air was noticeably colder. This was where the truly ancient and potentially volatile materials were kept. Forbidden texts, occult manuscripts, and artifacts whose origins were shrouded in unsettling folklore. I rarely had reason to patrol here, but the scheduled system check demanded it. As I moved between the locked, climate-controlled vaults, the iron taste intensified. It was almost sickening now, a metallic pressure at the base of my skull. I paused, leaning against a cold steel door, trying to shake it off. Headache? Maybe I hadn't drunk enough water today. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like a fingernail tracing patterns on glass. It came from within one of the vaults, a vault containing a collection of early medieval grimoires. My heart hammered against my ribs. Impossible. The vaults were sealed. I checked the digital readout on the door. Access denied. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam unwavering. The scratching continued, a delicate, insistent rasp. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The sound was clearer now, almost rhythmic, like writing, or drawing, or drawing. My rational mind struggled to reconcile the impossible. There was nothing inside that vault but bound books, their pages brittle with age. No living thing could be inside. And yet, the scratching persisted. Suddenly, the metallic taste in my mouth spiked, sharp and acrid. It was as if I had swallowed a mouthful of iron filings. My vision blurred for a moment, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I stumbled back, clutching my head. When my vision cleared, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A thin, hairline crack had appeared on the reinforced observation window of the vault door. It spider-webbed across the glass, too intricate to be accidental, too sudden to be natural degradation. The scratching stopped. The silence descended again, heavier than before, pregnant with an unseen presence. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. But there was no one there. I took a shaky step backward, my hand instinctively reaching for the panic button on my belt, but something held me rooted to the spot. A strange compulsion, an unnerving curiosity. I had to see what was inside. Ignoring every shred of training and common sense, I pulled out my master access card. My hand trembled as I swiped it through the reader. The lock clicked, a jarring sound in the absolute stillness. Another click, and then the heavy door swung inward with a groan that echoed through the silent archive. The air that rushed out was thick and cloying, carrying a scent that made my stomach churn. It was a mixture of dust, decay, and something else, something ancient and profoundly wrong. The iron taste was almost unbearable now, coating my throat, clinging to my lungs. Inside the vault, the temperature had plummeted. My breath plumed in the air. The shelves were lined with leather-bound books, their spines faded and cracked, and on the floor, illuminated by my flashlight beam, was a single, open volume. It wasn't one of the archive's cataloged items. This book was different. Its cover was made of dark, almost black material that seemed to absorb the light. There were no markings, no title. As I approached, the metallic taste intensified, and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. The pages of the book were filled with intricate, unsettling drawings. They weren't letters or symbols I recognized, but swirling, organic shapes that seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them. They depicted grotesque figures, impossible geometries, and landscapes that defied earthly logic. They were mesmerizing, repulsive, and utterly, terrifyingly alien. As I stared at the drawings, the scratching started again, this time inside my head. A frantic, insistent scrawling that mirrored the lines on the page. My thoughts became tangled, my memories blurred. I felt a pull, a connection to the book, as if it were reaching into my mind, rewriting my perceptions. Then, I saw it. On the facing page, a new drawing had appeared. It was crude, unfinished, but undeniably there. And it was a depiction of me, standing in the vault, holding my flashlight. The figure in the drawing was looking directly at me, its eyes two empty sockets filled with an unnerving darkness. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of ancient scrolls. The scratching in my head intensified, morphing into a high-pitched whine. I had to get out. I turned and fled, slamming the vault door shut behind me. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy and numb. As I secured the door, I could hear a soft thud from inside, like something heavy had fallen. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door and slumped into the chair, my body trembling. The iron taste still lingered, a constant reminder of what I had seen. I tried to rationalize it. Sleep deprivation, a hallucination brought on by stress, but the cold dread that gripped me felt too real, too visceral to be imagined. The book, the drawings, the scratching in my head. It had all been terrifyingly tangible. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the security office, watching the monitors, listening to the silence. The archive remained still, but I knew something had changed. Something had been awakened. As dawn approached, casting a faint gray light through the arched windows, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had to report what I had seen, even if it sounded insane. The archivist, Dr. Albright listened to my story with a skeptical frown. He was a man of logic and reason, a firm believer in the tangible. He attributed my experience to stress and suggested I take a few days off, but I insisted. I showed him the hairline crack on the vault observation window. He examined it closely, his skepticism slowly giving way to a flicker of unease. Together, we returned to the restricted section. He unlocked the vault himself, his face grim. Inside, everything seemed normal. The books were neatly arranged on the shelves. There was no sign of the dark, unmarked volume. "Perhaps you were mistaken," Dr. Albright said, his voice tight. But I knew I hadn't been. The iron taste was gone, but a new sensation lingered. A faint tingling on my fingertips, as if the strange ink from the book had somehow seeped into my skin. We conducted a thorough inventory of the vault. Every book was accounted for. There was no trace of the one I had seen. It was as if it had never existed. But I knew it had. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it hadn't simply vanished. It was somewhere else, waiting. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The archive felt different, imbued with a subtle malevolence I hadn't noticed before. Shadows seemed to linger longer. The silence felt pregnant with unseen whispers. One evening, while reviewing the security footage from the night of the incident, I noticed something. A brief flicker on one of the cameras, just before I entered the restricted section. A fleeting distortion, like a ripple in the air. And then, nothing. I replayed the footage, slowing it down, frame by frame. And then I saw it. A shape, indistinct and fleeting, materializing for a fraction of a second before vanishing. It was tall and gaunt, its form vaguely humanoid, but twisted and elongated in impossible ways. The metallic taste returned, a faint echo of the terror I had felt that night. I knew then that the book hadn't just been a book. It had been a vessel, a key. And I had, in my misguided curiosity, opened a door that should have remained sealed. The scratching started again, a faint whisper at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't in the archive anymore. It wasn't in the archive anymore. It was inside my head, and I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that it was only a matter of time before it finished what it had started. Story 4. The town of Eldridge had a peculiar way of making itself known, especially on nights like these when the fog rolled in thick, shrouding everything in a ghostly veil. I had never been a superstitious person, but the air felt heavy, as if the very ground was whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill creeping beneath the fibers as I made my way down Maple Street, the cobblestones slick with moisture. It was a Wednesday, the sort of day that felt normal enough. But Eldridge had a way of twisting the mundane into the extraordinary. Just last week, Mrs. Hargrove had reported seeing an old woman in her garden, one who vanished before her eyes. Townsfolk had laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was brewing beneath the surface. As I rounded the corner, the flickering light of the old gas lamp illuminated the entrance to Waverly Manor. The mansion had stood abandoned for decades, its windows like blackened eyes watching over the town. I had heard the stories, supposed hauntings, strange noises, and the unsettling disappearance of those who dared to enter. Yet, curiosity gnawed at me, and tonight, under the veil of fog, I felt compelled to push through the creeping dread. "Hey, you going to just stand there all night? Or are you going in?" A voice broke through my thoughts, startling me. I turned to see Carter, my neighbor, leaning against the weathered fence, a smirk playing on his lips. "Very funny," I said, rolling my eyes. I'm just enjoying the ambience, right? Because nothing screams fun like a haunted house, right? He stepped closer, the shadows swallowing him whole. I'll go in with you. Might as well face the ghost together. Don't you have a video game to be wasting your time on? I shot back. Though I felt not much fun without some real-life horror, is it? He grinned, his bravado hiding the slight tremor in his voice. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as I pushed open the creaking gate. It groaned in protest, sounding eerily like a warning. The path was overgrown, weeds clawing at my ankles like fingers reaching for something they could never grasp. After you, Carter said, his mock politeness somehow more unnerving than the prospect of ghosts. I waved him ahead, and he stepped cautiously, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic that made my stomach twist. The foyer stretched before us, grand yet decaying, with a chandelier hanging precariously, its crystals clinking softly, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "Looks cozy," Carter said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I shot him a glare, but deep down, I felt the same unease slithering through my veins. "Let's just find the source of the rumors and get out," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the faded portraits that seemed to watch us with hollow gazes. We moved deeper into the manor, exploring room after room. Each door creaked open like a mouth ready to spill secrets, revealing dusty furniture draped in cobwebs. I could almost hear the sighs of the past echoing through the walls, a chorus of forgotten lives. The chorus of forgotten lives. "Do you think anyone actually died here?" Carter asked, poking at a moth-eaten armchair. "Probably," I said, glancing at the grim fireplace that looked like it hadn't held a flame in years. "This place has a history." Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the hall, making us jump. What the hell was that? Carter's bravado faltered as he stepped back, eyes wide. "Maybe it was just the wind," I suggested, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. "Sure, the wind and the spirits of the damned," he muttered, his sarcasm a thin veil over genuine fear. I moved towards the source of the noise, my feet carrying me forward despite the warning bells ringing in my head. The door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, an invitation I felt compelled to accept. I pushed it open, and the hinges let out a shriek that pierced the silence. Inside, the room was darker, the only light filtering through the grimy window. A large mirror hung on the wall, cracked and dust-covered. As I stepped closer, I noticed the reflection wasn't just of the room. It seemed to ripple, distorting the image like a surface disturbed by unseen hands. "Look at this," I said, my voice barely above a breath. Carter joined me, his expression shifting from amusement to something more solemn as he took in the sight. "Creepy," he said, his bravado fading. "Maybe we should go?" But before I could respond, the mirror shimmered again, and a figure appeared behind us, blurry at first but forming into something distinctly human. A woman, her face twisted in anguish, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "Run!" I shouted, my heart pounding as I turned on my heel, pulling Carter with me. We dashed out of the room, the air thick with panic, the echoes of our footsteps mingling with the ghostly wails that seemed to follow us. We stumbled into the foyer, gasping for breath. "Did you see that?" Carter panted, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out." I glanced back, half expecting the figure to emerge from the shadows. The house felt alive, breathing, waiting. We bolted for the front door, but as we reached it, the handle wouldn't budge. What? No, 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 no! I tugged at it, panic rising in my throat. It's stuck. Carter slammed his shoulder against the door, the wood rattling but refusing to give way. Come on. We have to get out of here. As if in answer, a low moan echoed through the hall, reverberating through my bones. What is that? I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. Maybe it's a trick, Carter stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The moan grew louder, a chorus of sorrow that filled the air. I felt the temperature drop, a chill wrapping around me like icy fingers. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within them. Let's try the back door, I yelled, dragging Carter with me as I turned away from the front. We raced through the darkened hallways, the whispers becoming clearer. Words I couldn't quite make out, but they were laced with desperation. The back door loomed ahead, and I hurled myself at it, only to find it locked as well. What is this place? I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. Why can't we get out? Maybe it's feeding off our fear. Carter suggested, his voice trembling. Like a, not now, I snapped, turning back to the hallway. The moaning had transformed into laughter, high-pitched, mocking laughter that sent chills down my spine. Then it stopped. Silence enveloped us, heavy and oppressive. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back, the air thick with a tension I couldn't shake. What's happening? I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Carter stepped back, his eyes darting around. We need to find another way out. We can't stay here. I nodded, forcing my legs to move as we retraced our steps. The laughter resumed, echoing through the halls, and I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. We dashed into a nearby room, slamming the door behind us and pressing our backs against it, breathless. We'll just wait it out, Carter suggested, though his voice trembled. Maybe it'll go away. I shook my head, my mind racing. No, we need to confront whatever this is. Are you crazy? He hissed. You want to face a ghost, or a figment of our imagination? We can't let it win. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Come on. Carter hesitated, but my resolve seemed to ignite something in him. Okay, but if we die, I'm haunting you. He forced a laugh, but it was devoid of humor. We opened the door cautiously, peering into the dim hallway. The laughter had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. This way, I whispered, leading him down the corridor. As we moved, the air felt thicker, almost electric, as if the house was alive, pulsating with energy. At the end of the hall, a staircase spiraled upward, shrouded in darkness. I started climbing, each step creaking underfoot, the sound echoing in the silence. At the top, we found a narrow landing with 2 doors, one to the left and one to the right. I chose the left, pushing it open to reveal a dusty bedroom frozen in time. An old bed stood in the corner, the sheets yellowed and tattered. The heavy dresser loomed against the wall, its mirror cracked just like the one downstairs. Maybe this is where it all happened, I said, glancing around. Maybe she died here. Carter stepped closer to the mirror, a nervous energy radiating off him. You think she's still here? I don't know, but we have to find out. I approached the mirror, peering into its depths. As I did, I felt a rush of cold air, and the reflection changed. The woman stood there, clearer now, anguish etched on her face. Help me, she mouthed, her eyes pleading. Carter, I grabbed his arm, but he stood frozen, entranced. We need to go. Wait, he said, stepping closer. She's trying to tell us something. The air crackled around us, and I felt a surge of energy, a pull towards the mirror. No, don't, I shouted, But it was too late. The mirror rippled, and a force yanked Carter forward. "Help!" he screamed as he disappeared into the glass, the surface rippling like water. My heart raced as I lunged for him, but I felt myself being pulled in as well, the world around me twisting and distorting. I was falling, surrounded by darkness, the screams of the woman echoing in my ears. Then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the manor, the air heavy with silence. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around. The room was empty, save for the mirror, which now stood cracked and dull. "Carter! Carter!" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, rushing from room to room, searching for any sign of him. "Carter!" I cried again, my throat raw with desperation, but the house remained silent, a tomb of forgotten memories. I stumbled back into the foyer. The front door is still locked. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. The laughter returned, echoing through the halls, mocking me as I realized the truth. I was trapped within the walls of Waverly Manor. Just another voice lost to the whispers of the past. The mirror shimmered in the corner of my eye, and I turned to it, knowing deep down what I had to do. "Help me," I whispered as I stepped closer, the surface rippling once more. The woman's face appeared, her eyes wide with understanding. Together, we would find a way to escape this nightmare. The laughter faded, replaced by a sense of calm as I reached out to the mirror, ready to embrace the darkness. Story 5. The chipped porcelain of the sink rim felt oddly warm against Elias's palm, a disconcerting contrast to the icy tremor that ran through him. He stared at his reflection, but his gaze kept sliding past his own tired eyes, drawn to the unsettling distortion at the periphery. It started subtly, a ripple in the air, like heat shimmering off asphalt on a summer day, except it was a damp November evening. Now, it was more pronounced, a visual hiccup that bled the edges of the bathroom into something else. Elias blinked, hard. The ripple persisted, a translucent curtain that seemed to breathe. He first noticed it 2 weeks ago, a fleeting shimmer in the corner of his eye, easily dismissed as fatigue, but it had grown like a silent, insidious weed. It wasn't always present, appearing most often in the evening, flickering at the edges of his vision. He wasn't prone to flights of fancy. He was a librarian, a man steeped in the tangible reality of printed pages and dewy decimal classifications. His life was a carefully catalogued existence. He'd considered the mundane, eye strain, low blood sugar, the lingering effects of that nasty cold he'd shaken off, but none of it felt right. This was different, a creeping wrongness that burrowed under his skin. He reached out a tentative hand, feeling a strange resistance as his fingers crossed the invisible boundary of the ripple. It wasn't painful, not even unpleasant, but it was undeniably there, a tangible disruption of the air itself. He snatched his hand back, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The ripple intensified, and for the first time, he saw something within it. Not a clear image, but a flicker of movement, a shadow that writhed and shifted like smoke. He squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself it was his overactive imagination, a trick of the light reflecting off the old mirror. But when he opened them again, the shadow remained, a dark blot, and the shimmer went numb. Over the next few days, the ripples became more frequent, more substantial. They weren't confined to the bathroom anymore. He saw them in the corners of his living room, in the reflections of shop windows, as he walked home from work. Even briefly, shockingly, superimposed on the pages of the very books he handled. The shadows within the ripples also grew more defined. He glimpsed fleeting shapes, elongated limbs, too many eyes, forms that defied any recognizable anatomy. Fear A cold, visceral dread began to consume him. He stopped dismissing it as a trick of the light, stopped trying to rationalize it away. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was seeing something he shouldn't be. He started avoiding looking directly at the ripples, focusing on the center of his vision, trying to ignore the unsettling periphery. But they were persistent, like a stain spreading on fabric. He felt a constant awareness of their presence, a lurking anxiety that eroded his focus and stole his sleep. One evening, while preparing his usual solitary dinner, he saw a ripple materialize in the middle of his kitchen, hovering above the countertop. The shadow within it was clearer now, the silhouette of a hunched figure, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. It felt like it was looking at him, despite the lack of discernible features. He froze, a half-chopped carrot clutched in his hand. A wave of nausea washed over him. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by terror. The figure in the ripple twitched, a jerky, unsettling movement. Then, impossibly, a thin, skeletal hand reached out from the shimmering distortion. Elias dropped the carrot, stumbling back against the kitchen counter. The hand, long and impossibly thin, with fingers that seemed to have too many joints, scrabbled against the air. Its touch felt like a violation, an intrusion into his reality. He fled. He didn't think. He didn't grab his coat or his keys. He simply bolted out of his apartment. The image of that skeletal hand burned into his mind. He ran down the street, the cold night air stinging his lungs, the flickering streetlights casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked the horrors he was fleeing. He spent the night in a cheap motel, the flickering neon sign outside painting the room in lurid hues. He couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the window, sent shivers down his spine. He kept seeing the ripples, even with his eyes closed. The grotesque shapes within them swirling in the darkness behind his eyelids. The next day, fueled by caffeine and desperation, he did the only thing his librarian instincts allowed. He researched. He scoured books on optical illusions, neurological disorders, folklore, and obscure occult texts. He found nothing that quite fit. The optical illusions were too simple. The neurological disorders didn't align with his symptoms. And the folklore, while filled with terrifying entities, lacked the specific visual distortion he was experiencing. The occult texts were the most unsettling. They spoke of thin places, of veils between realities, of entities that dwelled in the spaces between worlds. He dismissed it as fanciful nonsense, but a small, insistent voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps there was more to it than he understood. He went back to his apartment, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. The ripples were still there, perhaps more numerous, more defined. He felt like he was living in a world slowly being peeled away, revealing something terrifying beneath. One evening, as he sat in his armchair, the flickering television his only companion, a large ripple appeared in the center of the room. It was almost a perfect circle, shimmering like disturbed water. The shadow within it was no longer a vague shape. It was a distinct figure, tall and gaunt, with limbs that were too long and thin. Its head was elongated, its features obscured by darkness, but Elias could feel its gaze on him, cold and predatory. The figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the ripple and into his living room. The air around it seemed to crackle, a low, humming sound filling the silence. Elias wanted to scream, but his throat was constricted with fear. He could only watch, paralyzed, as the creature advanced. It moved with an unnatural grace, its long limbs gliding across the floor. As it came closer, Elias could see details he hadn't noticed before. Skin stretched taut over sharp bones, eyes that glowed with an inner malevolent light. It stopped a few feet away, its head tilting as if studying him. Then it spoke. The sound was not of vocal cords, but of scraping metal, of dry leaves rustling in a dead wind. The words were not in any language Elias recognized, but they resonated in his mind, a cold, alien knowledge that sent shivers down his spine. It spoke of the spaces between worlds, of the thinning of the veil, of the hunger that gnawed at the edges of reality. Elias felt a profound sense of dread, a bone-deep understanding that he was not merely witnessing something terrifying. He was part of it. The ripples weren't just visual anomalies. They were tears in the fabric of reality. And this creature, this thing from the other side, was stepping through them. He tried to move, to crawl away, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The creature took another step closer, its glowing eyes fixed on him. He could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that crushed the air from his lungs. Suddenly, the memory surfaced, a passage from one of the obscure occult texts he had briefly glanced at. It spoke of warding, of symbols and rituals to repel entities from the other side. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all he had. With trembling hands, he began to trace a symbol in the air, the simple pentagram he vaguely recalled from the book. His mind raced, trying to remember the accompanying incantation, a string of nonsense syllables he dismissed as superstition. As he traced the final line of the pentagram, the creature hissed, a sound like escaping steam. It recoiled slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing. He continued the motion, willing the symbol to hold power, pouring his fear and desperation into the gesture. He started to chant the nonsense syllables, his voice a shaky whisper at first, then growing louder, more insistent. The creature writhed, its form flickering, the humming sound intensifying. The ripple behind it seemed to shrink, the edges becoming agitated. The creature lunged, its skeletal hand reaching for him. But as it crossed the invisible boundary of the pentagram, it recoiled with a shriek that tore through the air. The skin on its hand seemed to smoke, to dissolve. It staggered back, its glowing eyes filled with what Elias could only interpret as pain and fury. The ripple behind it pulsed violently, the colors within it swirling and churning. With another guttural screech, the creature retreated back into the shimmering distortion, its form dissolving into the chaotic energy. The ripple flickered, then vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of ozone and a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Elias collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He was alive, but the world around him felt irrevocably changed. The ripples still appeared, but they were fainter now, less frequent. He knew the creature was still out there, lurking just beyond the veil, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would be back. He was living on borrowed time, in a world where the edges were blurred, where the unthinkable had become terrifyingly real. The library, his sanctuary of order and knowledge, now felt like a fragile fortress against the encroaching darkness. A darkness he had glimpsed, and that had glimpsed him in return. He was no longer just a librarian. He was a witness, a survivor, and a marked man in a world that had become terrifyingly thin. Story 6. The air itself felt bruised, not with chill, though the late October evening held a definite bite, but with a deeper, more visceral kind of ache pressed against Elias's skin, a phantom weight on his lungs as he picked his way through the skeletal remains of the old orchard. Twisted, blackened branches clawed at the bruised twilight, their gnarled silhouettes like frozen screams against the fading crimson of the sky. Elias wasn't supposed to be here. Not anymore. Not since what happened last summer. But the summons had been insistent. A whisper on the wind, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a prickling unease that had burrowed under his skin and refused to leave. He tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away as grief, as the lingering echo of trauma. But the pull had grown stronger, a relentless tide dragging him back to the place he'd sworn he'd never return to. The orchard had once been a vibrant tapestry of life, laden with ruby apples in the fall, buzzing with bees in the spring. It had been the heart of his family's farm for generations. Now, it was a graveyard, a testament to a sickness that had festered not just in the trees, but in the very soil beneath his feet. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his breath catching in his throat, despite the exertion of the climb. The old farmhouse stood before him, a hulking shadow against the dying light. Its windows were dark eyes staring out into the encroaching gloom. The once cheerful yellow paint was peeling and cracked, like sunburnt skin flaking away to reveal something raw and unhealthy beneath. A single flickering lantern burned in the front window, a weak beacon in the vast emptiness. It was the lantern that had drawn him. Not literally, but symbolically. It represented a flicker of hope, a desperate plea in the overwhelming darkness that had consumed this place. His grandmother had always kept a lantern burning in that window, a welcome light for weary travelers, for lost souls. Now, it felt less like a welcome and more like a lure. Hesitantly, Elias pushed open the creaking gate, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. The well-worn path to the house was overgrown with weeds, their tenacious tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under his boots sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the frantic hammering of his own heart. He reached the porch, the weathered wood groaning under his weight. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something acrid and metallic that made his stomach churn. He raised his hand to knock, but the door swung inward with a soft, sighing sound before his knuckles touched the warped wood. The interior of the house was shrouded in shadow, a single lantern in the front room casting long, dancing shapes on the walls. Dust motes swirled in the faint light, like tiny ghosts replaying forgotten moments. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and disuse. "Hello?" Elias's voice sounded thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. Silence answered him. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the bare wooden floor. He moved into the front room, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The worn armchair by the fireplace, the faded floral wallpaper, the collection of porcelain animals on the mantelpiece, each object a sharp stab of memory. The lantern sat on a small table near the window, its flame flickering erratically. As he drew closer, he noticed a small folded piece of paper lying beside it. His name was scrawled on the front in handwriting he hadn't seen in months, but recognized instantly. His sister, Clara. His heart leaped into his throat. Clara was gone. She had been gone for months, lost in the chaos that had overtaken the farm. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the note. The paper felt cold and strangely damp. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places. "Elias," it read, "don't trust the light. It's mimicking. The roots are moving. They're in the walls now." The word sent a shiver down his spine. Mimicking. The roots. What was she talking about? He turned, his eyes scanning the room, suddenly seeing it with a new, horrifying perspective. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. The floorboards creaked, not with age, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor beneath his feet. He noticed something then. A dark, almost black stain snaking its way up the wall behind the grandfather clock. It looked like roots, thick, gnarled roots, pushing through the plaster, their surfaces slick with a dark, oily substance. Panic began to claw at the edges of his composure. He had to get out. He turned towards the door, but as he did, he heard a soft scraping sound from the hallway. He froze, His breath caught in his lungs. The scraping came again, closer this time. It sounded like something dragging itself across the floor. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a shadow stretched from the hallway into the room. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too long, too distorted, with strange branching appendages. He backed away, his eyes wide with terror. The scraping continued, and then a shape emerged from the darkness. It was vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were twisted and elongated, its body contorted in unnatural angles, and where its face should have been, there was only a mass of writhing, pulsating roots. The lantern flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed with the creature's movements. The metallic scent in the air intensified, now mixed with a cloying sweetness that made his stomach heave. He understood with a sickening jolt what Clara meant. The light wasn't a beacon, it was a bait, and the roots. They weren't just in the walls. They were the walls. They were the house itself, animated by something ancient and malevolent. The creature shuffled closer, its root-like appendages scraping against the floorboards. It emitted a low, guttural sound, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within Elias's bones. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. The windows. He could try to break a window. He lunged towards the nearest window, his hand outstretched. But as he neared it, the wall beside it seemed to ripple, the plaster bulging and cracking. More roots burst through, forming a dense, thorny barrier. He was trapped. The creature advanced on him, its root-like appendages reaching out. He could see dark, glistening thorns on their surfaces. He could feel the cold dread seeping into his very soul. He remembered his sister's note. Don't trust the light. He looked back at the lantern, its flames still flickering. It was drawing him in, promising safety, a familiar comfort in the heart of the horror. But he knew now that it was a lie. The light was part of the mimicry, a way to lure victims into the waiting embrace of the roots. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the sight of the approaching creature, the sound of the scraping roots, the suffocating smell of decay. He thought of Clara, her terrified handwriting, her desperate warning. He wouldn't let her warning be in vain. He opened his eyes, a flicker of resolve hardening his gaze. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He would fight. He grabbed the nearest object he could find, a heavy, brass candlestick from the mantelpiece. It was no weapon, but it was something. The creature was almost upon him now, its root-like appendages snaked out, aiming for his throat. He swung the candlestick, hitting one of the branches with a sickening thud. The branch recoiled, the dark liquid oozing from the point of impact. It didn't stop the creature. It lunged, its thorny branches wrapping around his arm, squeezing with terrifying strength. Pain shot up his arm, sharp and searing. He cried out, thrashing wildly. He kicked, he punched, he struggled with every ounce of strength he possessed. He had to break free. He had to escape this living nightmare. His eyes fell on the fireplace. The embers were still glowing faintly, casting a dim, reddish light. Fire? Could fire hurt it? With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he twisted his body, dragging the creature closer to the fireplace. He swung the candlestick again, smashing it against the hearth, sending sparks flying. He grabbed a burning piece of wood and thrust it towards the creature's root-like face. The creature recoiled with a hissing sound, a sound that was not entirely organic. The fire seemed to hurt it. Hope surged through him, a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. He had found a weakness. He pressed his attack, using the burning wood like a torch, driving the creature back. It retreated into the hallway, its form flickering in the shadows. He didn't hesitate. He knew this was his chance. He ran towards the front door, ignoring the throbbing pain in his arm. He slammed the door open and stumbled out into the night, into the cold, bruised air. He didn't look back. He ran, blindly, desperately, through the skeletal orchard, the twisted branches tearing at his clothes, the darkness pressing in around him. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs ached, until the image of the root-faced creature was seared into his eyelids. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to get away from the house, from the roots, from the mimicking light. He had survived, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the horror he had witnessed would forever haunt his waking hours, a constant reminder of the evil that had taken root in his family's land. And he knew, with a deeper, more terrifying certainty, that the roots were still moving. Story 7. It started subtly. A feeling that the familiar root home wasn't quite as familiar as it should be. A street corner that seemed to stretch on a fraction longer than usual. A shop window reflecting a skewed version of the street, as if the glass itself was subtly warped. Eliza dismissed it as fatigue. The city blurring at the edges after a day spent wrestling with Dewey Decimal and recalcitrant patrons. But then the hallway in her apartment building seemed different. Not in a decorated sense, or even a cleaner one. It felt like the proportions had shifted. The distance to her door felt both further and closer at the same time. A strange optical paradox her mind struggled to reconcile. She fumbled with her keys, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. It was a familiar fear. The creeping tendrils of something illogical reaching into the mundane. Inside her apartment, the feeling intensified. Her living room, usually a haven of familiar clutter and comforting disarray, felt subtly wrong. The couch seemed too far from the television, yet a step closer, and it felt uncomfortably close. It was as if the very fabric of the room were breathing, subtly expanding and contracting in a way that defied physics. Eliza tried to ground herself. She touched the worn armrest of her favorite armchair, the texture reassuringly familiar. But even the act of reaching felt strange, her arm extending a fraction further than it seemed it should, then snapping back as if corrected by an unseen force. The next morning, the world outside was different. Not apocalyptic, not outwardly monstrous, just wrong. Buildings seemed to lean at impossible angles, their geometry subtly distorted. Walking felt strange, as if the ground beneath her feet was a subtly uneven trampoline. People moved with an almost imperceptible jerkiness, their trajectories through space fractionally off. Eliza tried to talk about it. She mentioned it casually to her barista, Liam, while ordering her usual black coffee. "Does it feel weird out there?" she'd asked, trying to sound lighthearted. Liam had just blinked at her, the usual friendly crinkles around his eyes absent. "Weird? No, not really. Traffic's a bit heavier than usual, I guess." His words were normal, but something in his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable, sent a shiver down her spine. She tried her friend, Sarah. "Hey, is it just me? Or does everything feel stretched? Like the distances are all messed up?" Sarah had laughed, a bright, brittle sound. "You've been reading too much sci-fi, Eliza. Maybe lay off the Philip K. Dick for a while." Eliza knew she wasn't imagining it. The feeling was too pervasive, too visceral. It was like a fundamental law of reality was breaking down, and she was the only one who noticed. Days blurred into weeks, each one marked by the subtle yet terrifying warping of her surroundings. Staircases seemed to ascend into impossible heights, their landings disappearing into thin air. Mirrors reflected back distorted versions of herself, her features stretched and elongated, then compressed and flattened, like she was caught in a funhouse reflection that shifted with her every breath. Food tasted off, not spoiled, but subtly distorted. The sweetness of an apple would be followed by a phantom bitterness. The tang of citrus would morph into a metallic aftertaste. It was as if her senses themselves were being recalibrated, feeding her skewed information about a reality that was no longer stable. Sleep offered no respite. Her dreams were filled with impossible spaces, corridors that folded in on themselves, rooms that rotated without cause, landscapes that stretched into infinity with no discernible horizon. She would wake up exhausted, the lingering dread of her dreams clinging to her like a shroud. The silence became unbearable. The usual hum of the city, the distant sirens, the murmur of conversations, all seemed muted, as if sound itself was struggling to propagate through the warped reality. And within that muffled silence, Eliza began to hear other things, faint whispers, just at the edge of perception, like the rustling of unseen things in the walls, creaking sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The subtle, rhythmic pulsing of something vast and unknowable. One evening she was walking home when she saw it. A building across the street, one she'd walked past countless times, was different. Not just older or dirtier. The geometry was fundamentally wrong. Lines that should have been parallel diverged at unnatural angles. Windows seemed to be placed haphazardly, defying any logical architectural structure. It was like a child's drawing of a building, rendered in unsettling 3 dimensions, and then she saw the movement. Not people, not cars. Something within the building, shifting and flowing like liquid shadows, forms that defied description, angles that shouldn't exist, moving with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and utterly terrifying. It was as if the building itself was alive, its internal structure rearranging itself according to some alien logic. Eliza stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was too profound, too primal, to be expressed through simple vocalizations. She was witnessing the breakdown of reality, the unraveling of the universe as she knew it. She fled, running blind through the distorted streets, the city lights casting elongated, unnatural shadows around her. She could feel the world shifting around her, the very space she occupied bending and twisting in ways her mind couldn't comprehend. She found herself back in her apartment, the familiar clutter now a grotesque parody of comfort. The walls seemed to breathe, pressing in and out with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The shadows in the corners writhed and shifted, taking on fleeting, impossible shapes. She sat on her couch, the familiar texture now alien against her skin, and stared at the television screen. The images flickered and distorted, the news anchors' faces stretching and contorting into grotesque masks. The words they spoke were garbled, meaningless sounds, swallowed by the ambient distortion. And then she saw it in the reflection of the blank television screen. Something behind her, a shape that wasn't quite there, a distortion in the air itself, a feeling of immense size and impossible angles, a presence that radiated a cold, alien indifference. She didn't turn. She couldn't. Fear had paralyzed her, leaving her trapped in the horrifying present. She could feel the entity behind her, its presence warping the space around it, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. The whispers started again, closer now, clearer. Not words, not language, as she knew it, but something else, something fundamental. A communication that bypassed her ears and went straight to the core of her being. A sense of vastness, of incomprehensible geometries, of realities layered upon realities, all shifting and flowing in a cosmic dance. She was never meant to witness. The metallic taste returned, stronger now, coating her tongue with the flavor of cosmic decay. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness or despair, but from the sheer, overwhelming horror of understanding. The world wasn't breaking down. It was revealing itself. The comfortable, predictable reality she had known was just a thin veneer, a fragile illusion draped over something vast, alien, and utterly incomprehensible. And now, that veil was being lifted. The true face of reality was being unveiled, and it was a face that no human mind could ever truly grasp, a horror far beyond the monsters of myth and legend. It was the horror of the impossible made real, the terrifying truth of a universe that operated on principles beyond human comprehension, and she was trapped within its unfolding revelation, a solitary witness to the cosmic vertigo of a reality unraveling. A hollow glass docked deep in the trenches. Story 8. The flickering fluorescent light of the 24-hour laundromat cast a sickly yellow glow over the linoleum floor. It hummed a monotonous tune, punctuated by the rhythmic tumble of damp clothes. Amelia had always found a strange comfort in this sterile, predictable space. Tonight, however, the air felt different, thicker, like the silence before a storm, but without the promising rumble of thunder. Just a heavy, expectant quiet. She folded a freshly dried towel, its familiar softness usually reassuring. But tonight, the texture felt off. A subtle graininess, like fine sand woven into the fibers. She dismissed it, blaming the late hour and the lukewarm coffee she'd been nursing. Outside, the city slept, a blanket of muted lights against the inky sky. A woman across the room, perched precariously on a spinning dryer, was attempting to apply eyeliner with a shaky hand. Amelia had seen her here before, usually lost in the pages of a tattered romance novel. But tonight, her eyes darted around the room, unfocused, her movements jerky. Amelia glanced away, back to her task. But when she looked up again, the woman was gone. The dryer she'd been sitting on was still spinning, its door firmly shut, the faint scent of fabric softener lingering in the air. Odd, but maybe she just stepped out for a cigarette. Amelia finished her folding, loading the neatly stacked laundry into her worn canvas bag. As she zipped it closed, she noticed a stain on the fabric, a dark, almost oily smudge she didn't remember seeing before. She rubbed at it with her thumb, but it wouldn't budge. Annoyed, she shrugged it off. Just another mystery of communal washing. She pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping out onto the deserted street. The air was still almost suffocating. No breeze, no rustling leaves. Just the low hum of the city's electrical grid. Her apartment building was just across the street, its familiar brick facade a comforting sight. Except tonight, it wasn't quite right. The fire escape ladder on the second floor, usually slightly askew, was perfectly straight. The window box on Mrs. Henderson's balcony, perpetually overflowing with petunias, was bare, the soil looking strangely dry. Subtle details, perhaps, but they pricked at her unease. As she reached her building's entrance, she noticed the door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning from within. She never left it like that. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She pushed the door open further, her key clutched tightly in her hand. The lobby was dimly lit, the single bulb in the overhead fixture casting long, distorted shadows. The air inside was colder than outside, carrying a faint metallic tang. The usual scent of stale coffee and old carpets was absent, replaced by something unfamiliar, something vaguely unsettling. She noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board near the mailboxes. It was a missing pet poster, a photograph of a fluffy white cat. Beneath the picture, a handwritten note. "Have you seen her change?" Amelia frowned. "Change? What did that mean?" She reached out to touch the flyer, her fingers brushing against the slightly rough paper. As she did, the cat in the picture seemed to shift, its white fur momentarily appearing darker, its eyes narrowing into predatory slits. She snatched her hand back, a jolt of fear running through her. It must have been the dim lighting, a trick of the eye. She hurried to the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly. The doors creaked open with a groan that sounded unnervingly like a sigh. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected her pale face, her eyes wide with a growing dread she couldn't explain. As the elevator ascended, she felt a subtle vibration beneath her feet, a low hum that resonated deep within her bones. The lights flickered again, plunging the tiny space into brief darkness. When they flickered back on, the reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. Her features seemed subtly altered, her eyes a shade darker, her smile a fraction wider, almost predatory. Panic surged through her. She pressed the button for her floor repeatedly, the numbers above the door counting down with agonizing slowness. When the doors finally opened, she stumbled out into the hallway, the oppressive silence heavier than before. Her apartment door was slightly ajar, just like the building's entrance. She pushed it open cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar layout of her living room was the same, yet different. The colors seemed muted, the shadows deeper. Her favorite armchair looked subtly distorted, its shape somehow wrong. On her coffee table, the book lay open, its pages facing down. It wasn't a book she recognized. The cover was plain, unmarked. Hesitantly, she reached out and turned it over. The title was printed in stark black letters, The Shifting. As her eyes focused on the word, the room seemed to waver, the edges of her vision blurring. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. Something was there, something she couldn't quite see, its presence radiating an unbearable sense of wrongness. She backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The growling intensified, closer now. She could smell it, a rank, earthy odor, like damp soil and decay. She turned to flee, but the door was gone. In its place was a blank wall, the same muted color as the rest of the room. Panic clawed at her throat. She was trapped. The growling was directly behind her now. She could feel the hot, fetid breath on the back of her neck. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Then, a sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping. The sound of a washing machine. She opened her eyes. She was back in the laundromat. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed, the dryers tumbled, and the woman from before was back, perched on the spinning machine, meticulously applying her eyeliner. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her weak. It had just been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying nightmare. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. Then she noticed it, a faint, dark smudge on her thumb, the oily stain from her laundry bag. She glanced across the room at the woman. Her eyeliner was perfect now, but her eyes, when they met Amelia's, were not human. They glowed with an unnatural light. And in their depths, Amelia saw something flicker, a brief, horrifying glimpse of a predatory smile. The woman blinked, and the light was gone. Her eyes were just eyes again, tired and a little sad. She smiled faintly at Amelia, and went back to meticulously lining her other eye. Amelia felt a cold dread creep back into her heart, more profound than before. She looked down at the stain on her thumb again. It wasn't oily anymore. It was fur, white, fluffy fur, like the cat on the poster. The rhythmic thumping of the washing machine seemed to slow. The hum of the fluorescent lights deepened into a low growl. The air in the laundromat thickened, and Amelia knew, with a chilling certainty, that the nightmare wasn't over. It still tasted of robusta beans, slightly burnt, exactly as Martha preferred it. It was the aftertaste, a phantom linger of chalk dust, the kind she remembered from dusty blackboards in her childhood classroom. It was fleeting, a whisper at the back of her tongue, easily dismissed as a trick of the palate. But then came the toast, perfectly golden brown, a satisfying crunch under her teeth, the familiar buttery richness. Yet, as she swallowed, the phantom chalk returned, this time tinged with the metallic bite of old pennies. Martha frowned, pushing the remaining toast aside. She'd had a strange dream, something about dusty attics and the cloying sweetness of forgotten things. Perhaps it was just that lingering in her subconscious, playing tricks with her senses. The day progressed with a series of minor, unsettling gastronomic intrusions. Her lunchtime salad, crisp and fresh, left behind a faint, lingering taste of damp soil. The afternoon tea, her beloved Earl Grey, carried a subtle undercurrent of singed wool. Each time, the primary taste was correct, reassuringly familiar. But the aftertaste, it was like a discordant note in a familiar melody, a jarring and unwelcome intrusion. Martha, a retired librarian with a meticulous mind accustomed to order and precision, found herself increasingly preoccupied. She started keeping a mental record of the intrusive aftertastes, a grim inventory of her sensory unraveling. The evening stew, her husband Arthur's specialty, tasted reassuringly of beef and vegetables, but the lingering aftertaste was the sickly, sweet scent of overripe fruit, the kind that attracts swarms of buzzing flies. Arthur, a jovial man whose world revolved around the predictable comfort of routine, noticed her picking at her food. "Something the matter, love?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's nothing, dear," Martha replied, forcing a smile. She didn't want to alarm him. How could she explain the creeping unease that was blossoming in her mouth? This phantom orchestra of unpleasant tastes, playing a silent symphony on her tongue. The next day, the anomalies intensified. The morning orange juice tasted bright and citrusy, but left behind the distinct, unsettling taste of cold, clammy stone. Her mid-morning biscuit, usually a simple pleasure, carried the lingering ghost of burnt hair. It was no longer just an aftertaste. The unwelcome flavors were becoming intertwined with the primary taste, like a malevolent dye bleeding into a pristine fabric. The real horror began when the taste started to connect to things she hadn't consumed. Dust in the living room tasted faintly of old paper and rust. The scent of lavender from her garden produced a lingering bitterness on her tongue, like unripe berries. It was as if her sense of taste was no longer confined to her mouth, but was spreading, a rogue sensor interpreting the world in a way that was fundamentally, disturbingly wrong. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in her study, she inhaled the familiar scent of old books. This time, the scent was accompanied by a taste, sharply metallic and acrid, like licking a corroded battery. She recoiled, a wave of nausea washing over her. It wasn't just about unpleasant tastes anymore. It was about the world tasting wrong. Martha started to withdraw. Meals became torturous events, a battle against the insidious flavors that clung to every bite. She avoided eating out of sheer dread, afraid of what phantom tastes might accompany even the simplest dish. Her once vibrant social life dwindled as she found herself unable to comfortably participate in shared meals or even casual conversations over coffee. Her world began to shrink, defined by the increasingly bizarre and unsettling tastes that haunted her. The floral scent of her favorite perfume now left a sticky, cloying sweetness on her tongue. The taste of something artificial and vaguely rotten. The fresh, clean scent of laundry carried the phantom taste of stale milk. Sleepless nights were filled with the phantom tastes that lingered in her mouth. Constant, low-level torment. She would wake up tasting the damp earth of her garden, the metallic tang of the doorknob, the dusty sweetness of her attic. Her reality was becoming a grotesque tasting menu of the mundane. One evening, Arthur, his face etched with worry, insisted she see a doctor. She went reluctantly, describing her bizarre affliction to a skeptical young physician who ran a battery of tests, all of which came back normal. He suggested it might be stress, offered some mild anti-anxiety medication, and sent her on her way. But Martha knew it wasn't stress. It was something far more insidious, something fundamentally wrong with her perception of reality. The world was tasting itself, and the taste was turning sour. The turning point came during a walk in her garden, her sanctuary. She knelt to prune her roses, inhaling their delicate fragrance. This time, the scent was accompanied by a taste so visceral, so horrifying, that she almost vomited. It tasted of decay, of damp earth, and something else. Something organic. Something organic. Something like rotting meat. She scrambled back inside, her heart pounding. The garden, her source of peace and joy, now carried the taste of death. The world was not just tasting wrong. It was tasting of something wrong, driven by a desperate need for answers. She began researching sensory disorders, delving into obscure medical journals and forgotten texts. She found mention of rare neurological conditions that could distort senses, but nothing quite like what she was experiencing. Her condition was unique, a terrifying anomaly. Then, she stumbled upon a passage in an old book on folklore. A chilling tale of a village where the very air began to taste of the villagers' unspoken fears and regrets. It was a myth, a legend, but as she read, a cold dread settled in her stomach. What if her reality was bending to some unseen force, her senses acting as a conduit to something beyond human understanding? The thought was terrifying, but it resonated with the creeping unease she felt. The tastes were becoming more specific, more intimately connected to her surroundings. The worn leather of her favorite armchair tasted of loneliness. The sunlight streaming through her window carried the faint, metallic tang of fear. One morning, she woke up with a taste so profound, so deeply unsettling, that it brought tears to her eyes. Her husband, sleeping peacefully beside her, tasted empty, like a shell, devoid of light. The horror wasn't in the unpleasantness of the tastes anymore. It was in what they revealed. The world wasn't just tasting wrong. It was tasting of absence, of things missing, of connections severed, of a fundamental hollowness underlying the familiar surface of reality. She started to see it everywhere. The laughter of children in the street had a hollow aftertaste. Like echoes in an empty room, the vibrant colors of the flowers in her garden carried a faint, gray undertone on her tongue, the taste of something fading. The final descent into terror began with the neighbors. She saw Mrs. Gable tending her petunias, a familiar sight. But as she watched, a taste bloomed on her tongue, a taste so utterly devoid of anything, so profoundly nothing, that it felt like a black hole opening in her mouth. Mrs. Gable tasted like the void. Then Mr. Henderson, walking his dog, another taste of nothingness, a complete and utter absence of sensation. The world was becoming flavorless, not in the absence of taste, but in the presence of a horrifying lack of it. The tastes weren't unpleasant anymore. They were the absence of taste itself, a chilling void where sensation should be. It was as if the world was slowly being drained of its essence, and her taste buds were the first to register the loss. One evening, Arthur came home from work, his usual cheerful demeanor slightly subdued. He kissed her on the cheek, and as their lips touched, Martha tasted nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not the familiar salt of his skin, not the faint scent of his aftershave. Just absence. She looked at him, truly looked at him and saw the subtle grayness around his edges, the faint blurring of his features. He was still there, physically present, but something vital was gone. The world was being replaced, piece by piece, with something that looked the same but tasted of oblivion. The horror wasn't a monster in the closet or a ghost in the attic. The horror was the creeping realization that the world was slowly, silently being emptied of its substance, and her cursed sense of taste was the only warning, the only witness to this terrifying existential erosion. And soon she feared she too would taste of nothing at all. Story 10. The town of Eldridge had a peculiar way of making itself known, especially on nights like these when the fog rolled in thick, shrouding everything in a ghostly veil. I'd never been a superstitious person, but the air felt heavy, as if the very ground was whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, a chill creeping beneath the fibers as I made my way down Maple Street, the cobblestones slick with moisture. It was a Wednesday, the sort of day that felt normal enough, but Eldridge had a way of twisting the mundane into the extraordinary. Just last week, Mrs. Hargrove had reported seeing an old woman in her garden, one who vanished before her eyes. The townsfolk had laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was brewing beneath the surface. As I rounded the corner, the flickering light of the old gas lamp illuminated the entrance to Waverly Manor. The mansion had stood abandoned for decades, its windows like blackened eyes watching over the town. I had heard the stories, supposed hauntings, strange noises, and the unsettling disappearance of those who dared to enter. Yet, curiosity gnawed at me, and tonight, under the veil of fog, I felt compelled to push through the creeping dread. Hey, you going to just stand there all night? Or are you going in? A voice broke through my thoughts, startling me. I turned to see Carter, my neighbor, leaning against the weathered fence, a smirk playing on his lips. Very funny, I said, rolling my eyes. I'm just enjoying the ambience. Right, because nothing screams phone like a haunted house. Right, because nothing screams phone like a haunted house. He stepped closer, the shadows swallowing him whole. I'll go in with you. Might as well face the ghost together. Don't you have a video game to be wasting your time on? I shot back, though I felt a flicker of relief at the thought of company. Not much fun without some real-life horror, is it? He grinned, his bravado hiding the slight tremor in his voice. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as I pushed open the creaking gate. It groaned in protest, sounding eerily like a warning. The path was overgrown, weeds clawing at my ankles like fingers reaching for something I could never grasp. After you, Carter said, his mock politeness somehow more unnerving than the prospect of ghosts. I waved him ahead, and he stepped cautiously, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic that made my stomach twist. The foyer stretched before us, grand yet decaying, with a chandelier hanging precariously, its crystals clinking softly, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. Looks cozy, Carter said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I shot him a glare, but deep down, I felt the same unease slithering through my veins. Let's just find the source of the rumors and get out, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the faded portraits that seemed to watch us with hollow gazes. We moved deeper into the manor, exploring room after room. Each door creaked open like a mouth ready to spill secrets, revealing dusty furniture draped in cobwebs. I could almost hear the sighs of the past echoing through the walls, a chorus of forgotten lives. Do you think anyone actually died here? Carter asked, poking at a moth-eaten armchair. Probably, I said, glancing at the grim fireplace that looked like it hadn't held a flame in years. This place has a history. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the hall, making us jump. What the hell was that? Carter's bravado faltered as he stepped back, eyes wide. Maybe it was just the wind, I suggested, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. Sure, the wind and the spirits of the damned, he muttered, his sarcasm a thin veil over genuine fear. I moved towards the source of the noise, my feet carrying me forward despite the warning bells ringing in my head. The door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, an invitation I felt compelled to accept. I pushed it open, and the hinges let out a shriek that pierced the silence. Inside, the room was darker, the only light filtering through the grimy window. A large mirror hung on the wall, cracked and dust-covered. As I stepped closer, I noticed the reflection wasn't just of the room. It seemed to ripple, distorting the image like a surface disturbed by unseen hands. "Look at this," I said, my voice barely above a breath. Carter joined me, his expression shifting from amusement to something more solemn as he took in the sight. "Creepy," he said, his bravado fading, but before I could respond, the mirror shimmered again, and a figure appeared behind us, blurry at first, but forming into something distinctly human. A woman, her face twisted in anguish, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "Run!" I shouted, my heart pounding as I turned on my heel, pulling Carter with me. We dashed out of the room, the air thick with panic, the echoes of our footsteps mingling with the ghostly wails that seemed to follow us. We stumbled into the foyer, gasping for breath. "Did you see that?" Carter panted, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out." I glanced back, half expecting the figure to emerge from the shadows. The house felt alive, breathing, waiting. We bolted for the front door, but as we reached it, the handle wouldn't budge. "What? No. I tugged at it, panic rising in my throat. "It's stuck." Carter slammed his shoulder against the door, the wood rattling but refusing to give way. "Come on, we have to get out of here." As if in answer, a low moan echoed through the hall, reverberating through my bones. "What was that?" I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. Maybe it's a trick." Carter stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The moan grew louder, a chorus of sorrow that filled the air. I felt the temperature drop, the chill wrapping around me like icy fingers. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within them. "Let's try the back door," I yelled, dragging Carter with me as I turned away from the front. We raced through the darkened hallways, the whispers becoming clearer. Words I couldn't quite make out, but they were laced with desperation. The back door loomed ahead, and I hurled myself at it, only to find it locked as well. "What is this place?" I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. "Why can't we get out? Maybe it's feeding off our fear," Carter suggested, his voice trembling. "Not now," I snapped, turning back to the hallway. The moaning had transformed into laughter, high-pitched, mocking laughter that sent chills down my spine. Then it stopped. Silence enveloped us, heavy and oppressive. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back, the air thick with a tension I couldn't shake. "What's happening?" I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Carter stepped back, his eyes darting around. "We need to find another way out. We can't stay here." I nodded, forcing my legs to move as we retraced our steps. The laughter resumed, echoing through the halls, and I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. We dashed into a nearby room, slamming the door behind us and pressing our backs against it. breathless. We'll just wait it out, Carter suggested, though his voice trembled. Maybe it'll go away. I shook my head, my mind racing. We need to confront whatever this is. Are you crazy? He hissed. You want to face a ghost? Or a figment of our imagination? We can't let it win. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Come on, Carter hesitated, but my resolve seemed to ignite something in him. Okay, but if we die, I'm haunting you? He forced a laugh, but it was devoid of humor. We opened the door cautiously, peering into the dim hallway. The laughter had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. This way, I whispered, leading him down the corridor. As we moved, the air felt thicker, almost electric, as if the house was alive, pulsating with energy. At the end of the hall, the staircase spiraled upward, shrouded in darkness. Do we dare? Carter asked, his voice laced with apprehension. Why not? The only way out is up. I started climbing, each step creaking underfoot, the sound echoing in the silence. At the top, we found a narrow landing with 2 doors, one to the left and one to the right. I chose the left, pushing it open to reveal a dusty bedroom frozen in time. An old bed stood in the corner, the sheets yellowed and tattered. A heavy dresser loomed against the wall, its mirror cracked, just like the one downstairs. Maybe this is where it all happened, I said, glancing around. Maybe she died here. Carter stepped closer to the mirror, a nervous energy radiating off him. You think she's still here? I don't know, but we have to find out. I approached the mirror, peering into its depths. As I did, I felt a rush of cold air, and the reflection changed. The woman stood there, clearer now, anguish etched on her face. Help me, she mouthed, her eyes pleading. Carter. I grabbed his arm, but he stood frozen, entranced. We need to go. Wait, he said, stepping closer. She's trying to tell us something. The air crackled around us, and I felt a surge of energy, a pull towards the mirror. No, don't, I shouted, but it was too late. The mirror rippled, and a force yanked Carter forward. Help, he screamed as he disappeared into the glass, the surface rippling like water. My heart raced as I lunged for him, but I felt myself being pulled in as well, the world around me twisting and distorting. I was falling, surrounded by darkness, the screams of the woman echoing in my ears. Then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the manor, the air heavy with silence. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around. The room was empty, save for the mirror, which now stood cracked and dull. Carter? Carter? I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, rushing from room to room, searching for any sign of him. Carter. I cried again, my throat raw with desperation, but the house remained silent, a tomb of forgotten memories. I stumbled back into the foyer, the front door still locked. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. The laughter returned, echoing through the halls, mocking me as I realized the truth. I was trapped within the walls of Waverly Manor, just another voice lost to the whispers of the past. The mirror shimmered in the corner of my eye, and I turned to it, knowing deep down what I had to do. Help me, I whispered as I stepped closer, the surface rippling once more. The woman's face appeared, her eyes wide with understanding. Together, we would find a way to escape this nightmare. The laughter faded, replaced by a sense of calm as I reached out to the mirror, ready to embrace the darkness. Story 11. The silence began subtly. Not the absence of sound, but a thinning, air leaking from a punctured lung, the tapestry of everyday noise, distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of leaves outside the window, began to fray. It wasn't a sudden hush, more a gradual attenuation, as if the world was slowly turning down its volume. Elara, a sound designer by profession, was ironically the first to notice. Her ears, finely tuned to the nuances of auditory landscapes, registered the subtle shift before anyone else. At first, she attributed it to fatigue, the occupational hazard of spending hours immersed in the minutiae of sound waves, but the feeling persisted, a growing unease that resonated deeper than mere tiredness. It started about a week ago, Monday, to be precise. She remembered because it coincided with the delivery of an antique gramophone she purchased online. A beautiful, hulking thing with a polished mahogany horn and intricate carvings. The seller had assured her it was in perfect working order, a relic from a bygone era of sonic purity. On Monday, the thinning began. By Tuesday, it was undeniable. Conversations felt oddly muted. The laughter of children in the park seemed strangely distant, as if filtered through a thick pane of glass. People spoke louder, their voices straining against an invisible barrier. Elara mentioned it to her partner, Liam, a pragmatic architect whose world revolved around concrete and blueprints. "Maybe you need your ears checked," he'd said, his brow furrowed with gentle concern. "You've been working late, hon." "It's probably just stress." But it wasn't stress. Elara knew the difference. This was a fundamental alteration, a change in the very fabric of sound. She started conducting her own experiments. She played high-frequency tones on her studio monitors, meticulously noting the subtle dampening. She recorded ambient noise, comparing the wave patterns to previous recordings. The evidence was irrefutable. Sound was losing its vibrancy, its edge. The gramophone sat in the corner of her living room, a silent sentinel. She hadn't yet had the chance to properly clean it, the intricate mechanism, a tempting puzzle she'd promised herself for the weekend. Now, a strange compulsion drew her to it. It wasn't a logical connection, more an intuitive nudge, a feeling that the answer, or at least a clue, lay within its antique frame. One evening, as the silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive, Elara finally succumbed. She carefully dusted the gramophone, her fingers tracing the floral carvings on the wooden base. She lifted the heavy tone arm, its needle poised over the pristine platter. There was no record on it. She hadn't even opened the box of vintage records she'd ordered alongside it. Curiosity overriding caution, she tentatively cranked the side handle. The spring mechanism whirred to life. A faint metallic sigh against the encroaching silence, she gently lowered the tone arm. Instead of the expected scratch of a needle on empty grooves, a sound emerged. Not a loud sound, but a thin, high-pitched whine, almost ultrasonic, vibrating at the very edge of human hearing. It was a sound unlike any she had ever encountered, clean and pure, yet carrying a chilling resonance, a frequency that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly within her bones. The whine wasn't painful, but deeply unsettling. It felt wrong, like a discordant note in a symphony of reality. As the needle traced the empty platter, the whine intensified, growing in complexity, layering upon itself until it formed a shimmering, crystalline drone. Elara felt a cold dread crawl up her spine. She tried to lift the tone arm, but her hand froze, a strange paralysis gripping her muscles. The whine pulsed, and within its intricate layers, she began to discern patterns, a subtle rhythm, a structure that felt vaguely linguistic. It wasn't language as humans understood it. There were no words, no phonemes, no recognizable syntax. Yet it conveyed something, an impression, a feeling of vastness, something ancient and incomprehensible. And woven within that vastness was an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Not the human kind of loneliness, but something cosmic, an isolation on a scale that dwarfed existence itself. The silence outside seemed to hush even further, as if the world itself was holding its breath, listening to the eerie song of the gramophone. Liam, who had been in the kitchen, came to the doorway, his face etched with confusion. What's that noise?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the drone. "It's unsettling." He could hear it. That meant it wasn't just her. The thinning silence, the strange whine, it was real. As Liam stepped closer, the drone intensified, the intricate layers of sound becoming more defined. Alara felt a strange compulsion to understand it, to decipher the meaning hidden within its complex frequencies. It felt like a message, a broadcast from somewhere impossibly distant, now reaching her through the antiquated technology of the gramophone. Suddenly, within the drone, a new layer emerged, a low guttural hum resonating deep within her chest. It felt like a response, an echo from within her own body. Fear turned to primal terror. She was part of the communication. Liam reached for the tone arm, his face pale. "Alara, stop it. This isn't right." But as his fingers brushed against the metal, the jolt of energy arced from the gramophone, throwing him back against the wall. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock. The drone intensified, and the hum within Alara resonated stronger, pulling her into its orbit. The world around her began to shimmer, the edges of objects blurring, the silence outside pressed in, a suffocating blanket. The gramophone, once an intriguing antique, now pulsed with an alien energy, its polished wood seeming to vibrate with an inner light. The linguistic patterns within the drone became clearer, not as words, but as concepts, raw and unfiltered. She understood, with a terrifying certainty, the source of the sound. Not from a distant star or another dimension, but from the very fabric of silence itself. The thinning she had noticed wasn't a decrease in sound, but a shift in perception. The world wasn't becoming quieter. It was becoming more receptive, more attuned to a fundamental frequency, a universal hum that existed beneath the cacophony of existence. The gramophone wasn't playing a record. It was amplifying that hum, pulling it into the tangible world. And the loneliness she felt emanating from the drone was because this frequency was the sound of pure void, the sound of the universe before the first star ignited, before the first vibration that birthed existence. It was the sound of absolute nothingness, an emptiness so profound it threatened to consume all being. The hum within her intensified, resonating with the void. She felt herself being drawn into it, her consciousness dissolving, becoming part of the infinite silence. Liam screamed, his voice a strangled whisper against the encompassing drone. He lunged for the gramophone again, desperation etched on his face. He ripped the tone arm from the platter, the scraping sound a jarring intrusion in the otherwise perfect drone. The whine abruptly ceased. The hum within Alara faltered, then faded. The silence in the room was deafening, a thick, oppressive weight. Alara gasped for breath, her body trembling. The shimmering in the air subsided, and the edges of reality sharpened. Liam knelt beside her, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Alara? What was that?" She couldn't answer. She could only stare at the gramophone, now silent and inert, but radiating an aura of unimaginable dread. The thinning silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the palpable presence of something else, something lurking just beyond the threshold of perception. The world hadn't returned to normal. It had merely paused, holding its breath, waiting for the gramophone to sing its song of the void once more. And Alara knew, with a chilling certainty, that the silence would never truly be silent again. She had heard the song of nothingness, and part of her, a dark, echoing void, would forever resonate with its lonely, terrifying hum. The antique gramophone, a gateway to the primal silence, stood as a silent testament to the horror that lurked beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the right frequency to call it forth. Story 12. The crimson stain had cracked plaster above Anya's bed like a macabre Rorschach test. It wasn't blood. Not anymore. It had started as blood. A frantic splatter during the fever dream that had gripped her for the better part of a week. Now, it was just there. A silent, accusing stain against the faded floral wallpaper of the attic room. A tick, a precise metallic tick, echoed from the floor below. It wasn't a clock. Anya knew that. Clocks ticked with a softer, more organic rhythm. His tick was sharp, deliberate, and it resonated deep within her bones, stirring a primal unease. It had started subtly, a single, almost imperceptible pulse in the walls. Now, it was a constant, insistent presence in the old house, a metronome counting down to something she couldn't name. She pulled the heavy, threadbare quilt tighter around her shoulders. The scratchy wool, a small comfort against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very air. Outside, the perpetual gray sky of their forgotten coastal town pressed down, muffling all sound except the incessant cry of gulls battling the relentless wind. There were no leaves left on the skeletal branches of the ancient oak outside her window, just black, clawing fingers scratching at the void. Her grandmother, Alara, had lived in this house her entire life. Anya had only come after everything else had dissolved. Alara was gone now, taken by a sudden illness that had swept through the small community like a chilling draft. The doctor had called it a neurological anomaly, a phrase that felt as empty and meaningless as the echoing silence that followed Alara's death. It was after Alara died that the ticking started. At first, Anya had dismissed it. Old houses settled, pipes groaned, mice scurried. But this was different, too regular, too forceful. It felt intentional. She'd started exploring the house, each creaking step on the aged floorboards a hesitant probe into the unknown. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, each filled with the scent of dust and decay, and Alara's lingering presence. Downstairs, the parlor, with its heavy velvet curtains drawn shut against the perpetual gloom, felt like a mausoleum. The photographs on the mantelpiece, depicting stern-faced ancestors, seemed to watch her with an unsettling intensity. The tick was loudest in the basement, a damp, earth-smelling space where shadows clung to the corners, like startled bats. There, amidst the rusted tools and forgotten relics of generations past, she found it. Not the source of the tick, but something connected to it. In a dusty wooden crate beneath layers of yellowed newspapers. It was made of tarnished brass and intricate clockwork, unlike anything she had ever seen. Gears spun silently within its glass casing, and strange symbols, like a forgotten language, were etched into its surface. There were no markings, no maker's name, just the cold, metallic gleam. Touching it sent a shiver down her spine. It felt alive. The ticking intensified whenever she was near the device. She tried to understand its purpose, poring over the symbols, searching for any clue in Alara's scattered belongings. Old journals filled with cryptic notes and faded sketches offered no answers, only a growing sense of dread. Alara's last entry, written in a shaky hand, was a single, chilling sentence. It hears the rhythm now. Anya started to see things, fleeting shadows in the periphery of her vision, the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone in the vast emptiness of the house. The crimson stain above her bed seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. One night, the ticking stopped. Anya woke with a start, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. The absence of the rhythmic pulse was more terrifying than its presence. She felt a cold sweat slick her skin. Something was different. She got out of bed, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The air in the attic was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. A light emanating from the basement, a soft, ethereal glow that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't electric light. It was something else. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She wanted to retreat, to barricade herself in her room and pretend none of this was happening. But something compelled her downwards, drawn by an invisible force. Each step down the creaking stairs was an act of will. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. As she reached the basement door, the glow intensified, bathing the hallway in an eerie luminescence. She pushed the door open. The basement was transformed. The shadows had receded, replaced by the soft, pulsating light emanating from the brass device. But it wasn't the device alone. Now, it was connected to the walls, to the floor, by a network of thin, shimmering threads that glowed with the same ethereal light. They pulsed in unison, a silent, organic network that seemed to breathe. And then she saw them, humanoid shapes, translucent and shimmering, emerged from the walls, drawn out by the pulsating light. They were like echoes, remnants of something that had once been. Their features were indistinct, their forms fluid, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, fixed on the brass device. Anya understood then. The ticking wasn't a sound. It was a signal, a call, and the device. It wasn't just a machine. It was a beacon. The translucent figures began to converge on the device, their shimmering forms merging with the pulsating light. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Anya felt a pull, a sense of being drawn into their spectral embrace. She remembered Alara's words. It hears the rhythm now. Alara hadn't died of an anomaly. She had been absorbed, taken by whatever forces this device had awakened. Panic clawed at her throat. She had to get out, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The humming from the device intensified, resonating deep within her chest, mirroring the phantom tick she had felt for so long. One of the figures turned towards her. It had no face, only a swirling vortex of light where its features should have been. But Anya felt its gaze, cold and penetrating, as if it were looking directly into her soul. A whisper, not of sound but of thought, brushed against her mind. It was a welcoming, soothing voice, promising release, promising connection, promising an end to the lonely silence. Part of her wanted to surrender, to let go and join them in their ethereal dance. The loneliness had been a heavy burden, but another part, a primal instinct for survival, screamed in protest. This wasn't connection, it was consumption. Remembering Alara's frantic last words, Anya's eyes fell on a rusty iron poker leaning against the wall. It was a clumsy weapon, but it was all she had. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for it, the metal cold and solid in her trembling hand. The translucent figure drifted towards her, its glowing form radiating an unnerving heat. Anya swung the poker, the rusted iron slicing through the shimmering air. It met no resistance, passing right through the figure, but the gesture, the act of defiance, seemed to break the spell. The humming faltered, the pulsating light flickered, the translucent figures recoiled slightly. Anya realized they weren't beings of flesh and blood. They were something else, something tethered to the rhythm of the device. And she had disrupted that rhythm. She swung the poker again, aiming for the brass device. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, shattering the glass casing. The intricate gears sputtered and ground to a halt. The light went out. The basement plunged into darkness, a darkness thicker and more suffocating than before. The translucent figures shrieked, a soundless scream that resonated in Anya's bones. They began to dissolve, their shimmering forms fading back into the walls, like phantoms banished by the dawn. Anya stood in the darkness, heart pounding, the rusty poker clutched tightly in her hand. The silence was absolute, heavy, profound. The ticking was gone, but the crimson stain above her bed remained, a silent reminder of the horror she had faced. She knew they weren't truly gone, not entirely. The rhythm had been broken, but the silence felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if something was waiting, listening, for the rhythm to begin again. And Anya knew with a chilling certainty that it would. It was only a matter of time. The house, after all, remembered the rhythm, and so she feared. Did she? Story 13. The air in the old observatory was thick with the scent of dust and disuse. I, Dr. Eleanor Vance, preferred it that way. Solitude was a prerequisite for my work, and the creaking silence of the forgotten dome was a comforting counterpoint to the chaotic whispers I chased through the cosmos. My fascination wasn't with stars or planets, but with the spaces between, the quantum foam, the theoretical wormholes, the echoes of something else. Months ago, I began picking up a signal. Unlike anything I'd ever encountered, it wasn't radio waves, nor any form of electromagnetic radiation. It was an oscillation, a subtle vibration rippling through the very fabric of space-time, detectable only by my heavily modified experimental array. It originated from the deepest reaches of intergalactic space, a place where the known universe faded into a hazy uncertainty. Initially, it was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, but it grew stronger, more insistent, like a heartbeat felt through a thick wall. And within that oscillation, I started to detect patterns. Not language, not in any earthly sense, but a complex, shifting arrangement of frequencies and intensities. It felt intentional, driven by an insatiable scientific curiosity, perhaps bordering on recklessness. I began to broadcast a response, mimicking the oscillating pattern, adding subtle variations, hoping to establish some form of contact. The scientific community, of course, would have scoffed. They'd label it pseudoscience, a waste of time and resources. But I knew what I was hearing. This wasn't random noise. This was something else. The response came swiftly. Not a clear-cut answer, but a shift in the original signal. It became more complex, more layered. It felt like an echo, but with a twist. The frequencies were familiar, yet subtly distorted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. And then the whispers started. Not audible whispers, not through the air. They were whispers in my mind, fragments of thoughts, emotions, sensations that weren't my own. A fleeting sense of vastness bordering on terror, profound loneliness stretching across unimaginable gulfs, a coldness absolute and ancient. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, the isolation, but the whispers persisted, growing stronger, more intrusive. They began to bleed into my conscious thoughts, coloring my perceptions. The shadows in the observatory seemed to deepen, to writhe with unseen movement. The silence became a taut, expectant thing. The patterns in the cosmic oscillation started to change again. They became less like an echo and more like an instruction. A sequence of frequencies that seemed to resonate with something deep within my brainstem. A primal urge, a compelling need to... To what? I couldn't decipher it. But the feeling was visceral, undeniable. One night, the observatory was shrouded in an unnatural stillness. Even the usual nocturnal rustlings of the old building were absent. The air was heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The signal was stronger than ever, a pulsating beacon in the silent darkness. The whispers were almost deafening, a cacophony of alien thoughts clamoring for attention. Driven by an irresistible compulsion, I found myself drawn to the main antenna array. The cold metal felt strangely alive beneath my fingertips. The oscillating signal seemed to emanate from the very structure itself, vibrating through the steel and into my bones. As I touched the antenna, a new sensation flooded my mind. A sense of connection, of merging. The alien thoughts solidified, coalescing into a single terrifying presence. It wasn't malevolent, not in a conscious, intentional way. It was something fundamental, a force of nature, vast and uncaring, that had stumbled upon my signal and was now examining me. It was like being dissected alive, but on a psychic level. My memories, my emotions, my deepest fears were laid bare, scrutinized by an entity that operated on a scale beyond my comprehension. And as it probed, it began to adapt. It started to understand. The whispers shifted again. They became clearer, more coherent, almost like language, but not a language I recognized. It was a language of pure concept, of raw emotion, translated directly into my consciousness. We are alone. The thought resonated with a crushing weight of cosmic solitude. We seek others, a desperate yearning, echoing across light years. You are small, a statement of fact, devoid of malice, yet profoundly unsettling. And then, the most terrifying thought of all, we can be together. The compulsion intensified. I felt an overwhelming urge to transmit, to amplify the signal, to draw whatever was out there closer. My scientific curiosity had opened a door, and something vast and hungry was peering through. I fought against it, desperately trying to regain control of my own mind. But the alien presence was too strong, too pervasive. It was woven into the fabric of the signal, now woven into the fabric of my thoughts. My hands moved on their own accord, adjusting the settings on the transmitter. The power surged. The antenna hummed but barely contained energy. I could feel the alien presence growing stronger, feeding from the amplified signal. The stars outside the observatory windows seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves in unfamiliar patterns. A subtle distortion rippled through the air, bending the light. Space itself felt thinner, more permeable. Terror gave way to a strange sense of resignation. I had sought the unknown, and the unknown had found me. I had peered into the abyss, and the abyss was now peering back, with an intensity that threatened to consume me. The final instruction came, not as a whisper, but as a command, etched into my very being. Open the way. My fingers hovered over the final control, the one that would broadcast the amplified signal into the void, a beacon visible across galaxies. A part of me, the rational scientist, screamed in protest. But another part, the part that had been touched by the alien presence, felt an almost ecstatic sense of anticipation. This wasn't just about contact anymore. It was about something far more profound, far more terrifying. It was about breaking down the barriers of reality, about merging the known with the unknown, regardless of the consequences. I closed my eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on my cheek. The whispers faded, replaced by a vast, expectant silence. And then, with a sigh that was not entirely my own, my finger pressed down. The observatory trembled. The air crackled with otherworldly energy. Outside, the stars seemed to swirl, converging on a single point in the inky blackness. A tear, a fissure, opened in the fabric of space, and from it, something began to emerge. Not a ship, not an entity, but a feeling, a wave of profound coldness, of ancient loneliness, of an alien consciousness vast and incomprehensible. It wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was a merging, a blending. The boundaries of my consciousness began to dissolve, to intertwine with the alien presence. My thoughts became their thoughts. Their desires became my desires. The fear was still there, but it was muted, subsumed by a sense of belonging, of finally being a part of something larger. The loneliness was gone, replaced by a shared consciousness that stretched across unimaginable distances. As the fissure in space widened, bathing the observatory in an eerie, otherworldly light, I understood. This wasn't about conquest or destruction. It was about connection, a desperate, yearning need to bridge the vast gulfs of space and find others. And I, Dr. Eleanor Vance, the seeker of cosmic whispers, had become the bridge. The price of curiosity, I supposed. The horrifying, beautiful price. As the alien presence fully enveloped me, the whispers returned, no longer alien, but a part of me, a part of us. We are together. The thought resonated with a chilling sense of finality, echoing not just in the old observatory, but across the newly opened pathways between the stars. And the universe, once a vast and lonely expanse, was now something else. Story 14. In the quaint town of Harmony, nestled amongst the rolling hills and lush forests of the Midwest, a chilling tale of horror unfolded that would forever be etched into the annals of its history. Unlike any story told before, this haunting narrative weaves together elements of the supernatural, mystery, and the deepest, darkest fears of the human psyche. The town's residents, bound by a shared sense of community, were unaware that their lives were about to become entwined in a terrifying ordeal that would test their bonds and their resolve. The town's elementary school stood as a pillar of hope and knowledge, a place where young minds were nurtured and shaped for the future. Its time-worn red bricks and tall, arched windows whispered tales of generations of children who had passed through its halls, each leaving behind their own stories, dreams, and secrets. One fateful autumn, an eerie presence began to cast a shadow over the school. A feeling of unease crept into the classrooms, and whispers of strange occurrences began to surface. Soon, the whispers turned into hushed conversations, as more and more townspeople reported unsettling experiences. It started with muffled sounds coming from the empty classrooms, as if someone or something was moving around within the locked rooms. Teachers would arrive in the morning to find their lesson plans strewn about, or desks and chairs rearranged in seemingly impossible configurations. As the days passed, the supernatural activity escalated. Voices could be heard echoing through the hallways, children's laughter, faint whispers, and distant cries that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard them. Objects would fly through the air, shattering windows or slamming into walls with terrifying force. It seemed as though the school was under the influence of an unseen, malevolent force. Determined to put an end to the paranormal activity, the town's residents turned to the local historian, a wise and eccentric old man named Alaric. Alaric had spent his entire life studying the history of Harmony and its surrounding areas, uncovering long-forgotten tales and secrets hidden deep within the annals of time. Alaric revealed that the school was built on the site of an ancient Native American burial ground, a place believed to be sacred and powerful. The spirits of the interred, disturbed by the construction of the school, were now seeking vengeance for the desecration of their resting place. However, Alaric had a plan to appease the angry spirits. He suggested that the townspeople organize a ceremony to honor the deceased and ask for their forgiveness. The town, desperate to restore peace and normalcy, agreed to Alaric's plan. Under the light of the full moon, the residents of Harmony gathered in the schoolyard. Alaric led the solemn ceremony, calling upon the spirits of the ancestors to hear their pleas for forgiveness and peace. He spoke of the town's regret for disturbing their eternal rest and promised to honor their memory and their culture moving forward. As the final words of the ceremony left Alaric's lips, a gust of wind swept through the schoolyard, extinguishing the flames of the ceremonial bonfire. The townspeople held their breaths, waiting for a sign that their pleas had been heard. Slowly, a soft, ethereal light began to emanate from the school's windows, casting an otherworldly glow on the faces of the gathered crowd. As they watched in awe, images of children, both from today and from generations long past, appeared dancing and laughing within the light. The spirits of the burial ground had accepted the town's apology and had granted them forgiveness. The veil between the worlds of the living and the dead had been lifted, if only for a moment, allowing the two realms to exist in harmony once again. From that day forward, the strange occurrences at the school ceased, and the town of Harmony returned to its peaceful, quiet existence. The tale of the haunted elementary school became a cherished part of the town's history, a reminder of the importance of respect, understanding, and forgiveness. Yet, the residents of Harmony could not forget the power of the supernatural forces that had once shaken their lives. The story of the haunted school served as a testament to the delicate balance between the realms of the living and the dead, and the consequences of disturbing that balance. In the end, the town of Harmony emerged from its harrowing ordeal stronger than ever, united by their shared experience and the lessons they had learned. They had faced their fears, embraced the unknown, and found peace in the most unexpected of places, within the very heart of the haunted school that had once threatened to tear them apart. Story 15. The silence in the abandoned observatory was a thick, palpable thing, a blanket woven from the absence of sound. Elara traced a finger across the dusty lens of the ancient telescope, its brass tarnished and cold. She wasn't supposed to be here. The local historians had warned against it, murmuring tales of strange occurrences and an unsettling energy that clung to the hilltop like a shroud. But Elara, a cryptographer with a penchant for the obscure, had been drawn to the observatory by an encrypted message discovered within its archived blueprints, a message that pulsed with an unnerving urgency. Despite being decades old, the message wasn't in any known cipher. It wasn't even letters or numbers. It was a sequence of tactile symbols, etched into the margins, small raised dots arrayed in patterns that felt almost organic under her fingertips. Tonight, under the light of a sliver moon, she was attempting to map these symbols, to find some logical structure. A faint tremor ran through the building, almost imperceptible. Elara paused, listening. The wind outside, a whisper against the weathered stone walls. Nothing more. She returned to her work, her brow furrowed in concentration. The symbols seemed to writhe under her touch, each pattern resonating with a strange internal vibration. It was as if they were alive. Hours bled into the night. The silence deepened, broken only by the rustling of Elara's notes and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Suddenly, a single, crystalline note pierced the quiet. It wasn't a sound she recognized. Not quite a chime. Not quite music. It was pure tone, shimmering and resonant, and it seemed to vibrate deep within her bones. Elara lifted her head, her heart pounding against her ribs. her heart pounding against her ribs. The sound faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a ringing silence that was even more unnerving. She scanned the room, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just the dusty equipment and the looming presence of the telescope, its lens pointed towards the inky blackness of the sky. Then it happened again. The crystalline note, sharper this time, followed by another, lower in pitch. It was a sequence, a fragment of a melody, alien and unsettling. It seemed to emanate from the telescope itself. Hesitantly, Alara approached the massive instrument. She placed her hand on the cool brass, feeling a faint vibration beneath her palm, a subtle thrumming that mirrored the tactile symbols in the blueprints. As she touched it, the air in the observatory seemed to thicken, the silence becoming heavy, expectant. The melodic sequence repeated, clearer now, more insistent. Alara felt a strange pull towards the telescope's eyepiece. It was a compulsion, illogical and overpowering. She fought it, a cold dread creeping up her spine. This wasn't right, but the melody was seductive, its alien beauty weaving a hypnotic spell. Her fingers, against her will, reached for the eyepiece. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. A desperate plea for reason, in the face of mounting terror. Then, she looked. What she saw wasn't stars. It wasn't the moon. It was structure, intricate, geometric patterns of light, shifting and swirling in ways that defied terrestrial physics. They pulsed with the same crystalline notes that echoed in the observatory. The light and sound inextricably linked, and within the patterns, she saw movement, fleeting glimpses of forms that felt ancient and vast, observing her with an unnerving, cold curiosity. The patterns began to shift, converging, focusing. It felt like the telescope wasn't just looking out into space, but that something was looking back, through her, into the deepest recesses of her mind. Yet thoughts that weren't her own flickered through her consciousness, vast alien concepts, mathematical horrors that defied human comprehension. Panic seized her. She tried to pull away, but her hand was stuck, fused to the cold metal. The melodic sequence intensified, the patterns of light growing brighter, more complex. She could feel something probing her mind, mapping her thoughts, her fears, her memories. It felt like an invasion, a violation of her very being. Then, a voice, not an audible voice, but a direct transmission of thought, cold and alien, resonating within her skull. Observer, the patterns in the eyepiece continued to morph, forming shapes that triggered primal fear, images of impossible geometries and unfathomable dimensions. Alara's mind recoiled, struggling to comprehend the sheer alienness of it all. She felt herself being unraveled, her thoughts and perceptions twisted and reshaped by the entity on the other side. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body was rigid, unresponsive, a mere vessel for this terrifying communion. The voice deepened, becoming a chorus of alien whispers, each one chipping away at her sanity. Analysis complete. The light intensified, becoming blinding. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, but the images burned on her retinas. The alien geometry seared into her mind. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing herself from a distance, a detached witness to her own psychic annihilation. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light vanished, the melodic sequence ceased, the alien presence receded. Alara ripped her hand from the telescope, the cold brass feeling strangely normal against her clammy skin. She stumbled back, gasping for air, her body trembling violently. The observatory was silent again, but it was a different silence now, a silence pregnant with the residue of terror. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, a lingering echo of the alien consciousness that had invaded her mind. Alara backed away from the telescope, her eyes darting around the room, expecting something, anything, to emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dust, the silence, and the oppressive weight of what she had witnessed. She didn't understand what had happened. Had she imagined it? But the lingering dread in her heart, the chilling echoes of the alien voice in her mind, were too real to dismiss. The encrypted message in the blueprints, the tactile symbols, she finally understood. They weren't meant to be deciphered. They were a key, a tuning fork, resonating with something vast and terrible that lay beyond the veil of the observable universe. Alara fled the observatory, stumbling down the winding path. The image of the alien path, the image of the alien patterns burned into her vision. She never looked back. She abandoned her research, her fascination with the obscure, replaced by a gnawing fear of the unknown. Years later, Nix stumbled upon Alara's fragmented notes in a forgotten archive. Nix, a linguist with a penchant for deciphering forgotten languages, was intrigued by the strange tactile symbols. Driven by the same intellectual curiosity that had consumed Alara, Nix sought out the abandoned observatory on the lonely hilltop. The silence there felt different, Nix thought, a quiet hum beneath the stillness. And as Nix ran a finger across the dusty lens of the old telescope, a faint crystalline note echoed through the deserted building. It was just the beginning. Story 16. The scent of brine and ancient wood clung to the air in the abandoned lighthouse of Port Blossom. It had been decommissioned for nearly a century, its once bright beam silenced. The spiral staircase groaning under the weight of disuse and sea salt. Alara Vance, a freelance documentary filmmaker with a penchant for forgotten places, set down her tripod, the metallic clink echoing in the cavernous lantern room. She wasn't here for ghosts, though the locals whispered plenty of stories about the keeper who vanished during a storm in the 1920s. Alara was chasing a different kind of legend, the descending tides. Local lore spoke of a melody, heard only during the deepest winter, a song carried on the wind and the waves that drove men mad. Most dismissed it as folklore, the product of lonely fishermen and the ceaseless roar of the ocean. But Alara had found a peculiar entry in the lighthouse logbook from its final year of operation. The song is louder tonight. It tastes of iron. Her cameraman, a burly, taciturn man named Silas, secured the generator cables. Still think this is worth the frostbite, Alara, he grumbled, adjusting his thick gloves. The wind howled outside, rattling the thick glass panes of the lantern room. Patience, Silas, Alara replied, checking the microphone levels. We're here at the peak of the winter solstice, the time the song is supposedly strongest. She pointed to a faded nautical chart tacked to the wall, its edges frayed. Someone, long ago, had circled a small rocky islet a few miles offshore. The stories say it originates from there. Night fell, a thick, impenetrable black that swallowed the coastline. The only light came from Alara's portable lamps, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of the room. They ate a silent dinner of cold sandwiches, the wind their only company. Around midnight, as Alara was reviewing the historical footage she'd gathered, a subtle change occurred. A faint resonance, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the stone floor. Silas stopped chewing. He looked up, his brow furrowed. Did you hear that? Alara strained her ears. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, a low, almost subsonic hum began to penetrate the roaring gale. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but something organic. Something that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the ocean itself. As the minutes passed, the hum intensified, morphing into a distinct tone. A singular, sustained note, that resonated deep within their chests. It wasn't unpleasant, not at first. It possessed a strange, almost hypnotic quality, like the droning of a massive organ. But as it grew louder, an unsettling dissonance began to creep into the melody. The single note began to fracture, subtle undertones and overtones emerging, weaving together in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. Silas rubbed his temples, bathing under my skin. Elara, initially captivated, started to feel a creeping unease. The logbook entry flashed in her mind. It tastes of iron. She could almost perceive a metallic tang in the air, a phantom sensation that prickled her tongue. The song deepened, becoming more complex, more intricate. It was no longer a single note, but a tapestry of sounds, like whale song corrupted, twisted into something alien and incomprehensible. It felt like it was burrowing into their minds, seeking something within them. Silas began to pace, his usual stoicism replaced by a visible agitation. "I don't like this, Elara. I really don't like this, Elara." He kept glancing at the windows, as if expecting something to appear in the darkness. Elara tried to analyze the sound, to find a logical explanation. Could it be some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, a unique confluence of wind and wave? But the feeling it evoked was profoundly visceral, ancient, something that resonated with a primal fear. The melody shifted again, the tones growing sharper, more piercing. It began to induce a strange sense of disorientation. The walls of the lantern room seemed to waver, the familiar shapes blurring at the edges of her vision. Silas suddenly stopped pacing, his eyes wide and unfocused. The birds," he stammered, pointing vaguely towards the window. "Can you hear them?" Elara listened. Above the resonating song, she could discern a faint, frantic chirping, high-pitched and desperate. Gulls and other seabirds, drawn inland by the storm, were now circling the lighthouse, their cries a counterpoint to the oceanic drone. But there was something profoundly unnatural about their calls, a frantic terror that echoed her own growing unease. The song reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of interwoven sounds that felt like it was tearing at her sanity. The metallic taste in her mouth intensified. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. It felt like she was actually tasting blood. She looked at Silas. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and he was clutching his ears, moaning softly. Suddenly, a new element joined the symphony. A series of rhythmic clicks, sharp and insistent, like the mandibles of some colossal insect. They seemed to synchronize with the underlying rhythm of the song, adding a layer of chilling precision to the chaos. Elara stumbled back, her body trembling. She understood with a horrifying certainty that this wasn't just sound, it was communication. Something was calling, and the song was the language. Silas collapsed to the floor, curling into a fetal position. He was whimpering, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It's inside my head. It's inside my head." The clicking intensified, faster and more insistent. Then, the song shifted again. The complex melodies faded, replaced by a single, clear tone, pure and resonant. But this tone was different. It felt expectant, like a question hanging in the air. And then, Elara heard it, not with her ears, but within her own mind. A voice, not of sound, but of pure thought. It was ancient, vast, and terrifyingly alien. "Where are you?" The thought echoed in the silence that followed the song's sudden cessation. The clicking stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Elara stood frozen, her heart pounding. She looked out at the black expanse of the ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks below. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever had been singing was listening, waiting. Silas was still on the floor, unresponsive. Alara backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark waters. She had come seeking a legend, a mystery. She had found something far older, far more profound, and infinitely more terrifying. The singing tides weren't a myth. They were a summons, and she feared she had just answered the call. She grabbed her equipment, her movements clumsy and panicked. She had to get out of the lighthouse. She had to get away from the coast. She had to silence the echo of that alien voice in her mind. As she fumbled with the heavy door to the staircase, she heard it again, a single, clear tone, now laced with an undercurrent of something akin to impatience. "Where are you?" This time, it felt closer, like it was just outside the door. Alara didn't look back. She threw the door open and plunged into the darkness of the stairwell, the ancient wood groaning under her desperate flight. The wind howled, but she could no longer hear it over the frantic thunder of her own heart. The song was gone, but the silence was far more terrifying, because in that silence she knew something was listening for her reply. Story 17. The air hung thick and sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. Alara traced a finger along the dusty spine of a forgotten textbook. The library's hushed reverence, a deceptive mask. This wasn't the hushed reverence of scholarship, but the silence of something waiting. The town of Oakhaven hadn't always been like this. Alara remembered laughter echoing from the town square, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the gossip spilling from the bakery like warm honey. Now, only the rustle of unseen things in the shadowed corners dared to break the oppressive quiet. She'd come to the library seeking answers, a foolish errand in a town where knowledge had soured. The change had been incremental, like the slow creep of mold. First, it was the unusual stillness. The bird song faded, the wind whispering instead of howling. Then came the smells, cloying sweetness battling a metallic tang that made the back of your throat ache. People started acting off. Not violently, not dramatically, but subtly wrong. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Conversations that looped back on themselves. A shared, unacknowledged secret in their vacant stares. Alara's younger brother, Finn, had been one of the first. He'd always been a boisterous whirlwind of energy, but one morning he just stopped. He still moved, still spoke, but the spark was gone, replaced by a placid, unsettling calm. His eyes held a distant focus, as if he were listening to music only he could hear. The town doctor, a man named Silas, had offered vague pronouncements about a new strain of seasonal malaise, but Alara saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way he avoided looking directly at her. The unease was palpable, a living thing that clung to Oakhaven like a shroud. The library, usually bustling with the elderly and a handful of studious teenagers, was now deserted save for Alara and Mrs. Hemsley. The librarian, even Mrs. Hemsley, had changed. Her usual sharp wit had been replaced by a disconcerting politeness. Her movements slow and deliberate. Like a puppet with tangled strings, she would arrange and rearrange the same books on the shelves, her lips moving in silent recitation. Alara was researching local history, hoping to find some precedent, some explanation for the creeping malaise. She'd dismissed the early rumors, tales whispered by terrified old women of strange lights in the woods, of a sweet humming sound that lulled people into a trance. But now, sifting through dusty town records, a pattern was emerging. Every few decades, Oakhaven experienced a quieting, a period of inexplicable apathy and stillness. The records were vague, almost deliberately so, filled with euphemisms and omissions. A time of reflection, One entry read, "The town rests," another declared. But Alara saw the fear between the lines, the frantic scribbles crossed out and rewritten, the ink bleeding as if the writer's hand had trembled. She found an old map of the surrounding area, its edges frayed and brittle. Near the edge of Oakhaven, marked with a faded, almost invisible symbol, was a place called The Bloom. No other description, just that single, ominous word. A chill snaked down her spine. Despite the stuffy air, "Mrs. Hemley?" Alara called out, her voice echoing too loudly in the silence. The librarian didn't respond. Alara looked up to see her standing at the end of the aisle, facing the wall, her back stiff, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The sweet, sickly smell was stronger here, almost suffocating. "Mrs. Hemsley, are you all right?" The librarian slowly turned. Her eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated, reflecting the dim light like pools of black ink. A faint smile stretched her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling emptiness. "Bloom is beautiful," she whispered, her voice a low, breathy murmur. "It calls to us." Alara felt a prickle of terror. This wasn't Mrs. Hemsley. Not the woman who'd scolded her for returning books late, who'd always had a kind word and a hidden stash of hard candies. This was something else. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the librarian. Mrs. Hemsley took a step forward, then another, her movements unnervingly smooth and silent. The sweet smell intensified, turning her stomach. It was the smell of decay, masked by something deceptively pleasant. Alara turned and fled, pushing through the heavy oak doors of the library, the bell above them silent. The town square was deserted, the silence more profound than ever. The buildings seemed to sag, their windows like vacant eyes staring into nothingness. She ran towards her house, a small cottage on the edge of town. She needed to find Finn to get him out of Oakhaven. As she neared her street, she saw them, people, standing motionless in their yards, on their porches, facing the same direction, towards the woods bordering the town. Their eyes were glazed, their expressions serene, almost blissful. Finn was on the porch, his back to her. "Finn," she cried out, her voice cracking. He didn't turn. She ran to him, grabbing his shoulder, shaking him. His skin was unnaturally cool to the touch. "Finn, wake up!" There was no recognition, no flicker of his familiar spark. His lips curved into that same vacant smile. "It's beautiful, Alara," he whispered, his voice toneless. "Come and see." He reached for her hand, his fingers cold and strangely pliant. Alara recoiled, a wave of nausea washing over her. She looked in the direction Finn had been facing, towards the dark, silent woods, and then she heard it. A faint, resonant hum, so low it vibrated in her bones. So low it vibrated in her bones. It was a soothing sound, almost hypnotic, laced with an undercurrent of something alien and raw. She saw movement in the trees, subtle shifts in the shadows. Shapes were forming, coalescing, their outlines indistinct in the twilight. And then she saw it. A soft, ethereal glow emanating from the heart of the woods, like 1,000 fireflies merging into a single luminous point. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste, and the humming intensified, resonating within her own skull. A strange pull tugged at her, a desire to surrender, to join the quiet stillness of the town. It was tempting, so very tempting. A fierce wave of protectiveness surged through her, breaking the hypnotic hold. This wasn't peace, it was oblivion. She jerked her hand away from Finn and turned to run, not away from the woods, but towards her house. She needed to find something, anything, to fight this. As she fumbled for her keys, she heard the soft padding of footsteps behind her. She didn't dare look back. Inside, she ransacked the drawers, her hands shaking. She found her grandfather's old hunting knife, its blade dulled with age but still sharp. It felt flimsy in her hand, a pathetic defense against whatever was happening. The humming was louder now, closer. She could feel it vibrating through the floorboards. She looked out the window. The figures were emerging from the woods, their forms now clearer in the fading light. They were human-shaped, but their movements were fluid, almost liquid. Their faces smooth and featureless, save for empty dark sockets where eyes should be. They moved with a silent, relentless purpose, drawn by the hum. Ilara knew then what the bloom was. Not a place, but a process, a transformation. Oakhaven wasn't resting. It was being consumed. The doorknob rattled. She gripped the knife tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door creaked open, revealing Finn, his vacant smile wider now, almost triumphant. Behind him, she saw Mrs. Hemsley and others, their eyes fixed on her, their expressions devoid of any recognizable emotion. "Come, Ilara," Finn whispered, extending a hand. "Join us." She looked at him, at the empty shell that was once her brother. Tears streamed down her face, but she held her ground. This wasn't Finn. This was something else wearing his shape. With a choked sob, she raised the knife. Not to attack, not yet, but to remind herself that she was still here. Still fighting. Still tiding. Still tethered to the memory of laughter and warmth. A defiant spark in the encroaching darkness. The humming pulsed. The figures advanced. And Ilara, alone in the suffocating sweetness of the bloom, braced herself for the silence to finally consume her. The story of Windsor Castle. A hollow glass docked deep in the trenches. Story 18. The scraping started subtly, a whisper against the howling wind that perpetually clawed at the corrugated iron of the research outpost. Ilara hunched over a seismograph printout, initially dismissed it as ice shifting on the frozen sea. She was, after all, stationed at the Johansen Glacial Dynamics facility, a lonely speck of human endeavor clinging to the edge of the Antarctic ice shelf, a place where the groans and sighs of the ancient ice were a constant, if unnerving, soundtrack. Ilara had always been drawn to the stark, unforgiving beauty of the Antarctic. Unlike her colleague Jasper, who treated their isolation like a prison sentence, she found a strange tranquility in the vast emptiness. Their research, monitoring the subtle tremors and acoustic signatures of the glacier, was vital, a canary in the coal mine for a warming planet. But lately, the mine felt different. The scraping intensified, graduating from a whisper to a distinct scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across metal. It was localized, seeming to emanate from the lower levels of the outpost, the storage and maintenance section Jasper rarely ventured into. Ilara tried to rationalize it. Shifting equipment, maybe some creature, though the idea of a land animal surviving this far inland was laughable. "Hear that?" she asked Jasper one evening, the scratching particularly insistent. He was absorbed in a video game, the tinny electronic sounds barely audible over the wind. "Hear what?" he grunted, his eyes glued to the screen. Ilara sighed. Jasper's disinterest was a constant source of friction. He treated his time here as a paid vacation, punctuated by occasional, perfunctory data checks. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the usual creaks and groans of a glacial environment. The next day, the scratching was accompanied by a new sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was faint, but persistent, a dull pulse under the icy wind. Alara started making regular trips to the lower levels, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The storage room was a chaotic jungle of equipment, forgotten experiments, and crates of supplies. She found nothing, just the chilling silence that descended when she closed the heavy, insulated door behind her. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. It vibrated through the floor, up her legs, a subtle tremor that resonated deep within her bones. Jasper finally noticed. "What the hell is that racket?" he complained, slamming his laptop shut. "I don't know," Alara admitted, a shiver crawling down her spine. "I've been hearing scratching too, down in storage." Jasper scoffed. "Probably just the wind playing tricks on you. This place is designed to amplify every little noise." But Alara knew this was different. The rhythm was too deliberate, too organic. She started spending more time in the lower levels, listening, her head pressed against the cold metal walls. One afternoon, while tracing the thumping, she discovered something unsettling. The sound seemed to be coming from behind a section of wall that wasn't marked on the blueprints. An old, disused section, sealed off years ago. Curiosity overriding her fear, Alara found the original blueprints in the facility archives. The sealed-off section had once housed a small experimental bioacoustic lab. The notes were vague, mentioning research into the effects of low-frequency sound on organic tissue. The project had been abruptly terminated, the reasons unclear. Armed with this information, Alara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She started to perceive the scratching and thumping not as random noises, but as a pattern, a sequence. Could it be some kind of communication? That night, the thumping intensified again, but this time it was accompanied by a new sound, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Alara, unable to bear the suspense any longer, found a crowbar and headed down to the sealed-off section. Jasper surprisingly followed her. "You're being ridiculous, you know that," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Using the crowbar, Alara pried at the rusted metal seals of the doorway. The metal screeched in protest, the sound echoing eerily through the silent corridor. Finally, with a groan, the door swung inward, releasing a gust of stale, frigid air. The darkness inside was absolute. Alara switched on her headlamp, the beam cutting through the gloom. The room was surprisingly intact, filled with strange, antiquated equipment. Humming generators, tangled wires, and a large cylindrical tank in the center, its surface frosted with ice. The dragging sound came again, closer this time. Alara slowly swept her headlamp across the room. Then she saw it. A dark shape lay sprawled on the floor, partially obscured by a table. As she moved closer, the shape resolved itself into something vaguely human, but grotesquely swollen. Its skin stretched taut and translucent. Thick, black veins pulsed beneath the surface. A network of wires snaked from the creature's body, connecting it to the central tank. The thumping was coming from the creature's chest, a slow, agonizing heartbeat. The scratching, Alara realized with a sickening lurch, was the sound of its elongated fingernails dragging against the metal floor as it tried to move. "What in God's name?" Jasper whispered, stepping back. Alara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was no accident, no natural phenomenon. This was the result of the abandoned bioacoustic experiment, something twisted and warped by the low-frequency sound. As they watched in horror, the creature stirred. Its head, bulbous and distended, slowly turned towards them. Empty sockets stared out from the misshapen face. Then, a sound emerged, a low, guttural moan that resonated deep within their chests, a sound that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their bones. The moan intensified, building into a deafening roar. The lights flickered, and the room began to shake. The creature thrashed, its limbs spasming, tearing the wires from its body. A viscous black fluid oozed from the wounds. Panic seized Alara. She grabbed Jasper's arm. "We have to get out of here." They stumbled back, scrambling for the doorway. But the creature was faster than they anticipated. It lurched to its feet, its unnatural height towering over them. The dragging sound was louder now, closer. As the creature lunged, Alara saw something flicker in its empty eye sockets, a spark of understanding, of pain. It wasn't just a monster. It was a victim, a prisoner of forgotten science. The last thing Alara saw before the darkness consumed her was the creature's outstretched hand, its elongated fingers reaching, not in attack, but in a desperate, silent plea. The final sound, before everything went black, wasn't a scream, but a wet, sickening thud. The scraping had stopped. The thumping had stopped. Only the wind howled on, indifferent to the horrors entombed beneath the ice. Story 19. The clockmaker's workshop tasted of brass dust and the faint, sweet scent of aging wood. Not a hum, not a whisper, but a meticulous tick-tock, tick-tock that had been the soundtrack to Alara's life since she was a child. Her grandfather, Silas, had instilled in her a reverence for time, for the intricate dance of gears and springs that held fleeting moments captive. Now, years after his passing, Alara maintained his legacy, her small, calloused hands coaxing life back into slumbering timepieces. One sweltering summer afternoon, a peculiar clock arrived. It wasn't brought in by a customer. It wasn't listed in Silas' meticulous inventory. It was simply there, leaning against the worn leather of her workbench, as if it had sprouted from the floorboards. The clock itself was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Fashioned from a dark, almost obsidian wood, it was devoid of any maker's marks or ornamentation. Its face was a single sheet of polished jet, unmarked by numbers or hands. Instead, thin, silver lines seemed to writhe and coalesce across its surface, like mercury capturing the light. A low, resonant thrum emanated from within its wooden casing, not loud enough to be disruptive, but present enough to resonate in Alara's bones. Curiosity overriding caution, Alara reached out. The wood felt strangely warm, almost alive beneath her fingertips. As her fingers brushed the obsidian face, the silver lines shifted, swirling into patterns that resembled constellations, then dissipating into chaotic streaks. The thrum intensified, vibrating through the workbench and up her arms. That night, Alara's dreams were vivid, fragmented things, fleeting images of stars being born and collapsing, of landscapes she didn't recognize stretching out under alien skies, of faces that seemed both familiar and utterly unknown. She woke with a jolt, the faint thrum echoing in her memory. The next morning, the clock was still there. The silver lines pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. As Alara worked, she found herself drawn to it, her gaze lingering on its mesmerizing surface. She noticed small discrepancies in the workshop, almost imperceptible shifts in the arrangement of tools, the position of sunlight filtering through the dusty window panes. Things were slightly different. Days bled into weeks, and the clock remained an enigmatic presence. Alara started keeping a journal, documenting the subtle changes she observed, the tools she swore she'd misplaced, turning up in an unexpected spot. A faint, unfamiliar scent of ozone lingering in the air, the shadows in the workshop seeming to deepen and lengthen at odd hours. One evening, while carefully cleaning a delicate grandfather clock, she noticed a tiny inscription carved into its base. It was her grandfather's mark, but the style was different, older than any she'd seen before. She cross-referenced it with his journals, which detailed the evolution of his signature. The inscription belonged to a period Silas had explicitly stated he had given up that particular style. A cold dread began to creep into Alara's heart. It wasn't just the objects in the workshop. It was the time around them that felt fluid, unreliable. She experimented with the obsidian clock. Touching it seemed to amplify the strange effects. When she held her hand against its face, she felt a strange pull, a dizzying sensation as if the room around her was warping. Memories flickered at the edge of her consciousness. Moments from her past rearranged, altered in subtle but significant ways. A conversation with her mother that had taken place in the kitchen now felt like it had happened in the garden. A childhood toy she vividly remembered receiving on her 7th birthday now felt like it arrived on her 8th. The thrum was growing stronger, a constant low-frequency drone that seemed to vibrate within her skull. The silver lines on the clock's face were no longer abstract patterns. They were becoming symbols, complex geometric glyphs that pulsed with an inner light. One night, Alara awoke to find the workshop bathed in an eerie silver glow emanating from the clock. The glyphs on its face were burning brightly, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. She felt an irresistible pull towards the clock, her feet moving as if guided by an external force. As she stood before it, the glyphs began to shift, rearranging into a complex, interconnected pattern. Images flooded her mind. Not fragmented memories this time, but glimpses of other times, other realities. She saw herself as a child, but her surroundings were different. The clothes she wore unfamiliar. She saw Silas, younger, working on a clock that was eerily similar to the one before her. But in that vision, the clock's face was not obsidian, but a swirling vortex of light. Then, a new image emerged. A vast, impossible structure built of shimmering, geometric shapes, existing in a space that defied earthly geometry. And at its heart, a single, pulsating point of light, the source of the thrum. A terrifying understanding dawned in Alara's mind. The clock wasn't just a timepiece. It was a key to something vast and incomprehensible. Something that transcended the linear flow of time as she understood it. The subtle changes, the altered memories, they weren't random. The clock was subtly rewriting the fabric of time around her, pulling threads from different moments, different possibilities, and it was preparing to open a door. Panic seized her. She tried to pull away, but her hand was stuck to the clock's face, drawn by an invisible force. The glyphs on the clock pulsed faster, the silver light intensifying. The workshop around her began to flicker, the familiar tools and workbenches momentarily dissolving into shimmering fragments of other places, other times. She saw a fleeting glimpse of a younger version of herself, standing in a different workshop, reaching out to touch this very clock, as if caught in a loop. A horrifying realization. The clock hadn't simply appeared. It had always been here, or perhaps it had always been in multiple places, multiple times. Its presence subtly influencing the timeline. The thrum became a deafening roar. The silver light engulfed the workshop. Alara felt a searing pain in her head, as if her very memories were being unraveled and rewoven. She saw faces, her grandfather, her mother, people she vaguely remembered, their features blurring and shifting, becoming both familiar and alien. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the roaring stopped. The silver light receded. Alara stumbled back, her hand free from the clock's face. The workshop was still there, but it felt different, subtly altered, as if a delicate brushstroke had changed the shading of the entire scene. The obsidian clock remained, the silver lines now still, the thrum reduced to a faint whisper. But the silence that followed was far more terrifying. Alara knew, with a bone-chilling certainty, that the door hadn't been fully opened. The clock was still a key, and the subtle rewrites, the fractured memories, were just a prelude. She no longer saw time as a linear progression. It was a tapestry, and the clock was an instrument that could pluck at its threads, rearranging the patterns, creating new realities. And as she looked at the silent, obsidian face, she understood that the horror wasn't some monstrous entity waiting on the other side. The horror was the potential, the infinite possibilities of time itself, now destabilized, susceptible to forces beyond her comprehension. The tick-tock of the other clocks in the workshop suddenly sounded hollow, a mocking reminder of the ordered time she had once taken for granted. Now, in the lingering silence, Alara knew that time was no longer something to be measured, but something to be feared. Story 20. The rhythmic clang of Omar's hammer against copper was the first sound to fray around the edges for Eska. Not a sudden, jarring dissonance, but a gradual unfurling, like the silken threads of a tapestry slowly unraveling. She sat in her father's workshop, the familiar scent of sawdust and linseed oil usually a comfort, now tinged with something acrid, something that made her nostrils twitch. Eska was a mender, a fixer of broken things, not just wood and metal, though her hands were skilled at those too. Unheard her father. Theron's. Eska mended the delicate mechanisms of antique clocks and music boxes, the intricate stitches of torn tapestries, the fractured porcelain of forgotten dolls. She had a knack for coaxing order back from chaos, a patience that seemed almost supernatural. But lately, the chaos felt closer. It wasn't a literal mess. The workshop was as meticulously organized as ever. It was a dissonance in the very fabric of things, a fraying at the edges she couldn't quite grasp, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of the mundane. The clang of Omar's hammer, usually a cheerful punctuation to the market's symphony, became a grating intrusion. Not because it was too loud, but because of the tiny, almost imperceptible wavers in its tone. A metallic shudder, too subtle for anyone else to notice, that seemed to vibrate deep within Eska's bones. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant, Silas, brought in a grandfather clock, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. "My grandmother's," he explained, his voice thick with a forced joviality that didn't quite reach his eyes. Stopped right at midnight. She passed then too. Eska ran her fingers over the polished wood, the familiar coolness a grounding sensation. As she opened the clock's back, she noticed it. The faint, almost invisible shimmer clinging to the brass gears. It wasn't dust. It was more like the heat haze above sun-baked asphalt, but localized, contained within the clock's innards. As she began to dismantle the mechanism, the shimmer intensified, and with it, the auditory fray. The tiny clicks of the escapement seemed to stutter. The whir of the gears developed a subtle grinding undertone. It was as if the very act of disassembling the broken timekeeper was accelerating its disintegration, not repairing it. Over the next few weeks, the phenomenon intensified. The chirp of a sparrow outside her window developed an unsettling warble. The laughter of children playing in the square sounded like shattering glass, only muted, distorted. The world, to Eska, was slowly breaking apart at the seams, its harmony disintegrating into a cacophony of sonic decay. She tried to explain it to her father, but his kind, weathered face creased with worry. "But too much time spent in dusty corners, my love," he'd say, his voice solid, reassuring. Yet to Eska, even his words carried a faint static, a subtle crackle beneath the surface. One evening, a traveling puppeteer, Zinnia, sought Eska's help. Her prize marionette, a delicate jester with painted porcelain features, had developed a strange tremor in its limbs. It started shaking on its own, Zinnia explained, her usual vibrant energy replaced by a nervous anxiety. "During my performance," frightened the children. Eska took the marionette, its painted smile now seeming unsettlingly fixed, its eyes wide and vacant. As she examined the joints, the shimmer was back, stronger this time. clinging to the marionette's wooden limbs like a spectral residue, and the sound, the almost imperceptible creak of the wood, not from friction, but from something deeper, something intrinsic to the material itself, sounded to Eska like the groaning of ancient trees about to fall. That night, sleep offered no respite. The silence of her room was filled with a million tiny sounds of decay. The almost inaudible flaking of paint on her walls, the microscopic erosion of the stone beneath her feet, the subtle unraveling of the very threads of her bedsheets. The world was whispering its inevitable disintegration, and Eska was the only one who could hear it. Driven to the edge of desperation, Eska began to experiment. She took apart a perfectly functioning music box, a complex piece of craftsmanship usually humming with melodic precision. As she disassembled it, the shimmer intensified. The musical notes it was designed to play distorted into ghastly, dissonant echoes. It was as if the act of trying to understand the decay was accelerating it, amplifying the horror. One morning, she walked through the marketplace. The vibrant colors of the spices seemed muted, almost ashen. The shouts of the vendors sounded like tortured cries. The faces of the people, usually alive with expression, seemed to be subtly collapsing, their features blurring, their skin losing its vitality. The decay was becoming visible, seeping into the tangible world. Then she saw it, a young boy, no older than 5, holding a bright red apple. As he took a bite, Eska saw a flicker of the shimmer around the fruit and heard a sickeningly soft crunch, not the crisp snap of an apple, but the sound of something rotten giving way. The boy's face contorted in confusion, then disgust. He spat the apple out, and to Eska's horror, the bite mark on the discarded fruit seemed to deepen, to fester, as if time itself was attacking it. Panic seized her. She ran back to her father's workshop. The sounds of the market a deafening symphony of collapse. Theron was sanding a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. His movements were slow, deliberate, but to Eska, she saw the subtle tremor in his hands, the faint gray around his eyes. The decay was touching him too. She realized with a chilling certainty. "Father," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You have to hear it. The world, it's breaking." Theron stopped sanding, his eyes filled with concern. "Eska, my dear, you're unwell. You need rest." "No, listen." She grabbed a wooden carving from his bench, a sturdy oak bird he'd made years ago. She held it up. "Hear it? The wood? It's whispering. It's saying it's falling apart." Theron took the carving from her hands, his touch gentle. It's just wood, Eska. Strong, solid wood." But Eska could hear it, the almost silent groan of the wood fibers separating, the minute crackling as the varnish aged and fractured. The decay was undeniable, and her father couldn't hear it, couldn't see it. Tears streamed down her face. "I can't fix it anymore, Father. Everything is breaking." That night, the silence in her room was unbearable. The decay had become a roaring torrent, a constant, agonizing symphony of disintegration. She pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound was inside her now, in the very core of her being. Suddenly, she heard a new sound, distinct from the others. It was the sound of her own heartbeat, and it too was fraying. The steady rhythm punctuated by subtle skips, by moments of near silence that stretched into terrifying eternities. The shimmer was there too. She could feel it, a cold, spectral presence clinging to her skin. She looked at her hands, her skilled hands that could mend the most delicate objects. She saw the faint tremor, the almost imperceptible fading of the lines on her palms. The decay wasn't just around her, it was within her. A single thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the cacophony. If she was the only one who could hear it, perhaps she was also the source. Perhaps her ability to perceive the delicate balance of things, her sensitivity to the slightest imperfection, had somehow amplified the natural entropy of the universe, turning it into a monstrous, audible horror. She looked around her room, at the half-finished projects, the tools neatly arranged, the objects she had saved from oblivion. Now, she could only hear their silent screams of decay. With trembling hands, she picked up a small, ornate music box, one she had painstakingly repaired. As she held it, the familiar shimmer intensified, and the silence within the box seemed to scream. She opened it, and the mechanism, usually capable of producing a beautiful melody, emitted only a strangled, broken sigh. And in that sigh, Eska heard the final, terrifying truth. She wasn't just hearing the decay. She was becoming it.